I stared at the crushed remains of my daughter's custom birthday cake sitting on top of the kitchen trash. My sister stood there holding a mimosa, laughing as she told me that a kid I had by mistake at 23 was not worth wasting a $200 cake on. I simply wiped a smudge of frosting from my crying 12-year-old's cheek, picked up our coats, and walked out. The next morning, my mother called me sobbing hysterically, begging me to call the venue because my sister's wedding was being canceled. I took a sip of my coffee, told her I honestly did not care, and hung up the phone. I had no idea that my simple refusal would uncover a massive web of felony fraud that was about to destroy their perfect lives. My name is Cassidy, and I am 35 years old. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to protect your child from a toxic family. Growing up in our affluent Connecticut suburb, the sprawling colonial house my parents owned was designed to impress everyone who walked past our manicured lawn. Inside, however, it was a fortress of impossible expectations and emotional deep freezes. The aesthetic perfection of the crown molding and imported Italian marble floors stood in stark contrast to the absolute lack of warmth my parents Patricia and William provided. From my earliest memories, the family dynamic was painfully clear. My younger sister Brittany was the undisputed golden child. I was the inconvenient scapegoat, the one whose quiet demeanor and independent streak never quite fit into their grand societal ambitions. This particular Sunday was supposed to be a rare compromise. It was my daughter Lily's 12th birthday. I had ordered a beautiful, intricate vanilla bean cake with delicate spun sugar flowers, something I knew would make her eyes light up. My parents had insisted we come over for a family brunch, framing it as a joint celebration for Lily and a planning session for Brittany's upcoming wedding. I had reservations knowing how my family operated, but Lily loved her grandparents despite their emotional distance, and I wanted her to have a normal family experience. I carried the heavy bakery box into the house with care, setting it on the pristine granite counter in the kitchen before stepping out to help Lily bring in her small pile of gifts from the car. We were gone for exactly 5 minutes. When Lily and I walked back into the kitchen, my heart stopped. The beautiful pink and white bakery box was crumpled at the bottom of the stainless steel trash can. The cake itself was entirely smashed, the delicate sugar flowers crushed into the coffee grounds and discarded eggshells from breakfast. The vanilla frosting was smeared across the inside of the bin like a deliberate insult. Lily let out a small, confused gasp. She looked up at me, her large brown eyes immediately welling with tears. Before I could even formulate a question, the sound of confident clicking heels echoed on the hardwood floor. Brittany strolled into the kitchen wearing a silk bridal robe, casually sipping a mimosa from a crystal flute. At 30 years old, she had perfected the art of looking perpetually bored by the existence of anyone other than herself. She barely glanced at the trash can before waving her manicured hand in my direction. "Do not look so dramatic, Cassidy," she sighed, taking another sip of her drink. I needed the large dining table clear for my bridal gown fittings today. The seamstress is bringing her entire team, and we simply did not have the space for a messy children's party in the middle of it. Besides, a kid you had by mistake at 23 is not exactly worth wasting a $200 cake on. The casual cruelty of her words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. She did not just throw away a cake. She threw away my daughter's worth, reducing her existence to an inconvenience that was cluttering up her wedding preparations. I felt a hot, sharp flare of anger ignite in my chest. Before I could respond to my sister, my mother, Patricia, marched into the kitchen. She was clutching a clipboard full of wedding swatches, her face tight with irritation. Rather than expressing horror at the ruined birthday cake sitting in her garbage can, she immediately positioned herself defensively beside Brittany. "Stop overreacting this instant, Cassidy," my mother snapped, pointing a manicured finger at me. "Brittany is marrying into Jamal's family next month, and everything must be absolute perfection. Jamal comes from a highly educated, wealthy background, and his parents are flying in from Atlanta. We cannot have this house smelling like cheap bakery sugar and looking like a chaotic daycare center when the bridal team arrives. Your daughter's little party can happen at a pizza place later." The sheer audacity of her statement paralyzed me for a fraction of a second. The action-based history of our entire relationship was encapsulated in that one breathless defense of my sister. My mother had always viewed Jamal as a prize, a successful African-American architect from a genuinely affluent and respectful family. She was obsessed with matching his family's prestige, desperate to prove that the money they flaunted was real. And in order to maintain that illusion of perfection for Brittany, I was required to absorb every ounce of their disdain. "You threw her birthday cake in the garbage," I said, keeping my voice dangerously low and steady so I would not frighten Lily any further. "You have been a burden on this family since the day you got pregnant." "At 23, my mother countered, stepping closer to me with her chin raised. "We had to cut you off financially to teach you a lesson about responsibility. You chose to ruin your life with a child, but Brittany did everything right. She followed the rules. She is marrying a spectacular man from an outstanding family. She deserves to have the dining room for her fitting. You are being entirely unreasonable." The hypocrisy was staggering. They had indeed cut me off completely when I was a young, terrified mother claiming it was for my own good. While I was working 80-hour weeks to keep a roof over Lily's head and secretly building my career from absolute zero, they had fully funded Brittany's entire existence. They paid her rent, bought her cars, and financed her lavish lifestyle so she could project an image of effortless high society success. I looked down at Lily. A single tear had escaped and was rolling down her cheek, cutting a path through a tiny smudge of pink frosting she had accidentally touched when we first brought the box inside. She was so quiet, so used to being treated as an afterthought in this massive, cold house. I did not scream. I did not throw things. I did not give them the hysterical reaction they were actively trying to provoke so they could brand me as the unstable one. I simply reached into my purse, pulled out a tissue, and gently wiped the smudge of frosting from my daughter's face. "We are leaving," I told Lily softly, taking her small hand in mine. As I turned on my heel and guided my daughter toward the front hallway, the heavy oak door of my father's home office swung open. William stepped out, blocking our path to the front door. My father was a man who demanded absolute obedience, projecting the aura of a wealthy patriarch, despite the mounting stress lines around his eyes that he constantly tried to hide. "Where exactly do you think you are going?" he demanded, crossing his arms over his chest. "Home," I replied, not breaking my stride. "You are ruining your sister's special day with your constant negativity," he sneered, stepping squarely into the center of the hallway to force me to stop. "If you walk out on your sister's bridal fitting over something as petty as a cake, do not bother showing up to the wedding next month. We will not have you embarrassing us in front of Jamal's parents with your terrible attitude." I looked at the man who had watched me struggle for years, the man who was currently defending the casual destruction of his own granddaughter's birthday simply to appease his golden child. He thought his presence at the door was an immovable barrier. He thought the threat of exclusion from their high society spectacle would bring me to my knees and force me to apologize. I met his arrogant gaze perfectly. "Do not worry," I said, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling of the grand hallway. "I will not." I sidestepped him, smoothly opened the heavy front door, and walked out into the crisp afternoon air with my daughter. I did not look back as I heard my mother complaining loudly in the background about my lack of respect. I buckled Lily into the car, promising her that we were going to have the most spectacular birthday celebration the city had to offer, just the two of us. As I pulled out of the driveway and navigated down their tree-lined street, my phone began to buzz in the cup holder. It was not my parents demanding I return. It was a call from Thomas, my senior property manager. I let it go to voicemail, focusing entirely on comforting my daughter. I had absolutely no idea that when I finally checked my messages, I would discover a corporate alert that would change the trajectory of my entire family's life. I gripped the steering wheel tightly as we pulled out of my parents' tree-lined neighborhood, my knuckles white, my heart pounding a steady rhythm of suppressed rage against my ribs. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Lily staring quietly out the window, her small hands folded in her lap. She looked so utterly defeated. At 12 years old, she was entirely too young to understand the complex, toxic hierarchy of our family, but she was definitely old enough to feel the sting of being cast aside. I pulled the car over onto the shoulder of the road, put it in park, and turned around to face her. I promised her right then and there that nobody was ever going to treat her like an inconvenience again, especially not the people who were supposed to love her unconditionally. I told her we were going to have the greatest birthday celebration she had ever experienced. I drove us straight into the heart of the city, bypassing the usual chain restaurants and heading directly toward a towering glass-fronted luxury hotel that dominated the downtown skyline. I walked up to the VIP reception desk and secured the penthouse suite for the night. I did not flinch at the exorbitant price tag, easily swiping my premium credit card. We spent the entire evening ordering an absurd amount of room service. I requested a massive decadent chocolate truffle cake topped with fresh raspberries and 12 glowing sparklers, completely eclipsing the vanilla cake my sister had callously shoved into the garbage. We put on oversized fluffy white hotel robes, ate cake sitting right on the massive king-sized bed, and watched her favorite movies on the flat-screen television until we both fell asleep laughing. For that one perfect night, the cold reality of my parents and my sister ceased to exist. But the real world always comes crashing back, usually when you least expect it. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my cell phone vibrating aggressively against the marble nightstand. The digital clock on the wall read exactly 7 in the morning. Sunlight was just beginning to peek through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our suite, casting a warm, golden glow across the room, where Lily was still sleeping peacefully. I blindly reached for the phone, intending to silence the alarm, but saw my mother Patricia's name flashing urgently across the screen. My initial instinct was to decline the call. I had absolutely zero desire to hear another lecture about how I had ruined Brittany's bridal fitting by walking out so abruptly. However, the phone stopped ringing and then immediately started vibrating again. She was calling back to back. I slipped out of bed, wrapped my robe tightly around my shoulders, and walked out onto the private balcony, pulling the heavy glass door shut behind me so I would not wake my daughter. I swiped to answer, bringing the phone to my ear. Before I could even offer a simple hello, my mother's voice exploded through the speaker. She was absolutely hysterical, crying and screaming at a pitch that forced me to hold the phone several inches away from my head. "You need to fix this right now, Cassidy. You have to call them immediately. This is an absolute disaster," she wailed, her breath hitching in a dramatic display of pure panic. I leaned against the glass balcony railing, watching the morning traffic far below in the city streets. "Fix what, Mom? What are you talking about?" "The Grand Oaks Estate," she screamed, naming the most exclusive, heavily sought-after luxury wedding venue in the entire state. "They just sent an automated email saying they are permanently canceling your sister's wedding reservation. Do you understand what this means?" Brittany is completely inconsolable. She is locked in her bathroom hyperventilating. Jamal's parents already booked their first-class flights from Atlanta. His family is paying thousands of dollars for luxury accommodations in town. If we lose this venue, we will be the laughingstock of their entire social circle. We will look like absolute frauds. I listened to her frantic rambling, piecing together the sheer magnitude of her crisis. The Grand Oaks Estate was famous for its sprawling botanical gardens, crystal chandeliers, and a 2-year waiting list. Getting married there was the ultimate status symbol, exactly the kind of shiny, superficial validation my mother and sister practically lived for. "I fail to see how any of this involves me," I said, keeping my tone perfectly flat and devoid of any sympathy. "Are you completely dense?" Patricia snapped, her tone instantly shifting from desperate panic to her usual venomous condescension. "You work for the hospitality umbrella that manages that property. Do not play dumb with me, Cassidy. I know you do some sort of low-level event planning or desk work for their corporate office. I need you to call your supervisor right this second. Use your employee discount call in a favor offer to scrub their floors for a year if you have to. Just get that reservation reinstated immediately." She truly believed I was nothing more than a struggling mid-level employee scraping by on a meager salary. It was the narrative they had assigned to me years ago when they cut me off for getting pregnant, and they had never bothered to look deep enough to see anything else. They assumed I was barely surviving simply because I chose not to flaunt designer labels or drive flashy sports cars to their superficial Sunday dinners. "Cassidy, are you listening to me?" she demanded, her voice shrill and commanding. "You owe this family. We let you live under our roof for 18 years. We paid for your basic public school education while your sister had the pressure of private academies. You owe your sister this favor. Call your manager and fix this, or I swear I will make sure you are never welcome at another family holiday for the rest of your miserable life." I took a long, slow breath of the crisp morning air. I looked out over the sprawling city, a city where I secretly owned several highly profitable commercial buildings, including the very hotel I was currently standing in. I took a sip of my coffee, savoring the rich, dark flavor. "Honestly, I do not care," I replied smoothly. There was a split second of dead silence on the line, followed immediately by the sound of my mother inhaling sharply to unleash a barrage of screaming insults. "How dare you speak to me that way, you ungrateful little Patricia," began to shriek. I pulled the phone away from my ear, pressed the red end call button, and immediately blocked her number. A profound sense of liberation washed over me. For the first time in 35 years, I was not internalizing her venom. I was simply turning it off. I turned to walk back inside the suite, but before my hand could even touch the glass door, my phone vibrated in my palm again. I glanced down, expecting to see my father calling to continue the verbal assault, but it was not him. The caller ID displayed the name Thomas. He was my senior property manager, a sharp, incredibly competent man who handled the day-to-day operations for my highest-tier luxury real estate holdings. I answered the call immediately. "Good morning, Thomas. This is quite early for you." "Good morning, Miss Cassidy. I apologize for calling at this hour," Thomas said, his usually calm voice laced with a tight, unmistakable edge of professional concern. "I would not have disturbed you, but we have a critical situation that requires your immediate attention. Our automated security software just flagged a massive legal discrepancy in the billing system for the Grand Oaks estate." I leaned back against the railing, my senses instantly sharpening. A discrepancy. What kind of discrepancy? Thomas sighed heavily into the receiver. "Our system automatically canceled a high-profile wedding booking late last night because the financial routing numbers failed a secondary verification check. Someone attempted to override the standard billing protocol using a top-tier owner authorization code. The system locked the reservation down when it detected severe mismatched data." I frowned, my mind racing through the corporate protocols I had personally designed. An owner authorization code grants a 100% complimentary booking. It is meant exclusively for my personal use. Who tried to use it? "That is exactly the problem," Ms. Cassidy, Thomas explained carefully. "The social security number attached to the contract matches your personal identity file. But the names, the secondary contact information, and the billing addresses attached to the catering line of credit are completely different. The primary applicant listed on the contract is Patricia and the bride is listed as Brittany." The air in my lungs turned completely to ice. My mother did not just attempt to book a venue she could not afford. She had somehow acquired my private social security number, bypassed my company's standard client portal, and attempted to authorize a $150,000 wedding under my identity. They did not just lose their venue. They had actively committed felony identity theft against the very daughter they constantly belittled. "Thomas," I said, my voice dropping an octave as my protective mother instincts entirely vanished, replaced instantly by the cold, calculating mindset of a chief executive officer. "Do not touch anything in the system. Do not release the cancellation hold and print out every single digital signature associated with that contract." "Understood," Thomas replied efficiently. "How would you like me to proceed with the clients if they attempt to contact the venue directly?" "Direct all of their calls to the corporate legal department," I instructed, my eyes narrowing as I stared out at the skyline. "I am packing up my daughter and leaving the hotel right now. Have David waiting in the boardroom. I am on my way to the corporate office." The drive into the downtown financial district was a blur of morning traffic and cold clarity. I had my assistant Maria meet us in the private underground parking garage of the towering glass and steel high-rise that housed my corporate headquarters. Maria whisked Lily away to the executive lounge, promising her an endless supply of hot chocolate and streaming movies. I watched my daughter smile safe and completely oblivious to the impending implosion of her grandparents' lives before I stepped into the private elevator that required a biometric scan to access the top floor. My mother always assumed I worked in some windowless cubicle, perhaps managing catering schedules or answering angry customer emails for a hotel chain. She loved to introduce me to her high society friends as her daughter who works in the service industry, dripping with a condescension that made it clear I was the family failure. The reality was vastly different. I did not work in the hospitality industry. I owned a massive multi-million-dollar luxury hospitality and real estate portfolio. The skyscraper I was currently standing in belonged to my holding company. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing the sprawling expanse of the executive suite. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, reflecting off the polished marble floors and the sleek, modern art that decorated the walls. I bypassed my massive corner office and walked directly into the primary boardroom. Thomas was already there, pacing near the edge of a massive mahogany conference table. He was a sharp, impeccably dressed man in his late 40s who had managed my highest-tier properties for over 6 years. He knew how fiercely I protected my privacy and my corporate anonymity, which was exactly why the current situation had him looking visibly stressed. "Good morning, Thomas," I said, taking a seat at the head of the table. "Show me exactly what triggered the system override." Thomas let out a heavy sigh and slid a thick manila folder across the polished wood. "The Grand Oaks estate operates on a fully integrated booking platform," he explained, tapping the cover of the file. "Last night at approximately 11 o'clock, an electronic contract was submitted through our VIP portal for a wedding scheduled exactly 4 weeks from now. The bride is listed as Brittany, and the primary guarantor is listed as Patricia." I opened the folder. The first page was a comprehensive breakdown of the wedding demands, and reading it made my blood run cold. Brittany had not just tried to book a standard wedding package. She had selected the absolute highest tier of luxury our venue offered. The contract detailed requests for imported white orchids flown in from Holland, a customized 5-course menu featuring beluga caviar and Wagyu beef top shelf, vintage champagne for 300 guests, and the exclusive use of the estate's historic mansion for the entire weekend. The total calculated cost at the bottom of the page was a staggering $150,000. My parents were comfortable, but they were absolutely not $150,000 wedding comfortable. My father's manufacturing business had been quietly bleeding money for years, a fact I only knew because I had secretly bailed out his medical debts through a subsidiary company to keep them afloat. They could barely afford the lease on Brittany's luxury cars, let alone a wedding fit for royalty. I looked up at Thomas. How did they bypass the deposit requirement? A booking of this magnitude requires an immediate $50,000 wire transfer to secure the dates. "That is where the system flagged the discrepancy," Thomas said, leaning forward and pointing to the second page of the contract. "They did not submit a wire transfer or a credit card authorization. They submitted a completely manual contract override. They used a specific internal code meant to completely waive all venue and catering fees." I stared at the paperwork in absolute disbelief. The section intended for banking details was blank. Instead, the box designated for an owner-family complimentary override had been checked. My mother had demanded I use my lowly employee connections to get her a discount. When I refused, she clearly decided to take matters into her own hands. Patricia must have done some digging online, found my corporate employee portal, and attempted to push the contract through herself by claiming she was immediate family entitled to a staff discount. But she made a catastrophic miscalculation. Because of the way I had structured my corporate anonymity to hide my wealth from them, my name was not listed in the system as a standard employee. My profile was hard-coded with the highest level of executive clearance. The system did not process an employee discount. It processed an absolute owner override. To trigger an owner override, the system requires a secondary layer of authentication. I said, tracing the edge of the paper with my index finger. It requires my physical signature and my full social security number. Thomas silently slid the third page of the contract toward me. It was the digital verification form. Right there on the dotted line was my name. The signature was a looping, overly stylized script that I recognized instantly. It was my mother's handwriting, and printed directly beneath the forged signature, clear as day, was my private 9-digit social security number. A cold, heavy silence fell over the boardroom. I stared at my stolen social security number, and suddenly the mahogany table and the sweeping city views faded away. I was 23 years old again, standing in the cramped kitchen of my first apartment, holding a screaming, colicky newborn Lily. I had been working double shifts at a diner just to afford basic baby formula. I had managed to scrape together $2,000, hiding it in an old joint savings account my mother had insisted I keep open from high school, claiming it was strictly for extreme emergencies. I had planned to use that money to put a deposit down on a safer apartment. But when I went to the bank to withdraw the funds, the teller informed me the balance was zero. Patricia had walked into a local branch and legally drained the entire account. When I confronted her weeping and begging for the money I needed to feed my child, she simply rolled her eyes. She told me she had used the money to buy Brittany a celebratory designer handbag for getting accepted into her sorority. She looked me dead in the eye and told me that I owed them that money as back rent for being a massive disappointment and living under their roof with my teenage mistake. That was the exact moment I realized my family would bleed me dry to fund their golden child. That was the day I learned to become a ghost. I closed my personal accounts, opened a highly obscured limited liability company, and started quietly flipping distressed properties. I learned corporate structuring, tax law, and asset protection. I built a multi-million-dollar empire completely in the shadows, ensuring that Patricia and William could never, ever touch a single dime of my daughter's future. I slowly pulled myself back to the present moment. The memory of that stolen $2,000 replaced by the undeniable physical evidence sitting right in front of me. They had not just stolen my identity to sneak a discount. My mother had actively committed federal identity theft. She had forged the signature of a chief executive officer to fraudulently secure $150,000 in luxury goods and services. She had done it effortlessly, with the arrogant assumption that I was just a powerless pawn, whose identity she had a fundamental right to exploit. They did not know that by stealing my social security number, they had just handed me the key to their absolute destruction, Ms. Cassidy Thomas said softly, breaking the heavy silence in the room. The system automatically placed a hard legal freeze on the Grand Oaks estate reservation the moment the secondary verification flagged the discrepancy. That is why they received the cancellation email this morning. Our standard protocol for a discrepancy of this financial magnitude is to forward the flagged documents directly to the corporate fraud department. How would you like to proceed? I looked down at the forged signature, my mother's looping, arrogant handwriting. She thought she was so clever. She thought she was untouchable. I closed the manila folder and placed my hands flat on the polished table. I want you to bring David into this room immediately, I instructed, referring to my notoriously ruthless corporate attorney. We are not just holding the cancellation. We are going to verify every single piece of financial data attached to Patricia and William's names. I want to know exactly what other lines of credit they have attempted to open using my stolen identity. They wanted to play high society games using my name. We are going to show them exactly what happens when you steal from the house. David strode into the boardroom less than 20 minutes later. He was a former corporate litigator who had left a massive New York firm to become my personal general counsel. He was ruthless, intensely protective of my assets, and completely aware of my family dynamics. I slid the manila folder across the mahogany table toward him without saying a word. He opened it, his eyes scanning the forged signature and the stolen social security number. His jaw visibly tightened. He did not ask how they got the number or why they thought they could get away with it. He simply opened his encrypted laptop, synced it to our secure corporate server, and began running a comprehensive credit and liability sweep under my personal and corporate identity. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the rapid clicking of his keyboard. I watched him work, my hands folded neatly in my lap. Thomas stood quietly by the window, his posture rigid with professional outrage. Within minutes, David stopped typing. A deep furrow formed between his brows. He turned the laptop screen to face me, and the cold reality of my family's betrayal deepened into something far more sinister than a simple venue theft. Patricia did not just forge a venue contract, David said, his voice deadly serious. Once she bypassed the initial security protocol using your social security number, the system automatically pre-approved the account for our elite vendor credit line. She accepted the terms on your behalf. I leaned in, reading the brightly lit screen. My mother had authorized an additional $50,000 in unsecured credit directly tied to my corporate holding company. The itemized list of expenditures was sickening in its absolute entitlement. She had allocated $15,000 for imported white peonies and cascading floral arches to decorate the grand staircase. $20,000 was earmarked for a premium raw bar, white glove catering staff, and an endless supply of top-shelf vintage champagne. Another $15,000 had been designated for a live 10-piece orchestra and a custom lighting design that would project Brittany and Jamal's initials onto the dance floor. They were bleeding me dry to fund a high society fantasy they could never afford on their own. It gets worse, David explained, tracing the digital money trail on the screen with his pen. She linked the vendor payouts directly to a joint checking account she shares with your father. William is fully complicit. They used your identity to secure the massive corporate credit line, then routed the vendor contracts through their personal bank accounts to make it look like they were the ones paying the florists and caterers in cash. They are actively laundering your corporate credit to look like independently wealthy benefactors to Jamal's parents. The sheer audacity of the scheme physically repulsed me. I thought back to the countless times my father had lectured me on financial responsibility. I remembered standing in their perfectly appointed kitchen years ago, exhausted from working double shifts, listening to him call me a drain on their resources just because I asked to borrow $20 for baby formula. He had always paraded around the country club acting like a self-made titan of industry, judging everyone around him for their perceived lack of ambition. Now the arrogant patriarch who loved to boast about his moral superiority was actively committing federal fraud to maintain a fake lifestyle. They believed I was just a powerless, struggling single mother. They assumed that because I never fought back against their emotional abuse, I would be too weak to fight back against financial ruin. They thought I would quietly take the fall when the $50,000 bill came due, terrified of their social wrath and desperate to keep the peace. "Cancel the venue immediately," Thomas suggested quietly from the corner of the room, breaking into my thoughts. "We can void the credit line internally, flag the account to prevent any further unauthorized access, and absorb the vendor deposits through the Corporate Loss Prevention Fund." I looked from Thomas to David. A simple cancellation was what the old Cassidy would have done. The old Cassidy would have absorbed the abuse, quietly fixed the problem behind the scenes, and let them walk away with their reputations perfectly intact, just to avoid a family screaming match. But the woman sitting at the head of the mahogany conference table was no longer their scapegoat. She was an apex predator in the corporate world, and her family had just blindly walked directly into a steel trap. "No," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "Do not just cancel the venue. I want you to initiate a formal corporate fraud investigation. Execute the maximum internal security protocol immediately." David looked up from his screen, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. He knew exactly what that meant. Initiating a formal corporate fraud investigation was the absolute nuclear option. Because my hospitality group operated across state lines and managed millions of dollars in international vendor transactions, our banking security was tied directly to federal fraud databases. The moment David submitted the official fraud alert, our banking partners would automatically trigger a hard freeze on every single financial account connected to the fraudulent activity. That meant Patricia and William's joint checking account, their personal savings, their retirement funds, and the credit cards they had linked to the vendor payouts would be instantly paralyzed. The system algorithms would lock them out completely to prevent money laundering. They would not be able to buy a cup of coffee, put gas in their luxury cars, or pay the mortgage on that massive colonial house. They would be financially frozen out of their own lives within a matter of seconds. Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed with this level of escalation? David asked, his fingers hovering expertly over the keyboard. Once I hit submit, this data goes directly to the federal banking authorities. There is no quiet retreat after this button is pressed. The automated system takes over entirely. Your parents will be facing felony financial crimes, and their assets will remain frozen until a full federal audit is completed. I thought about my daughter's beautiful birthday cake sitting in the garbage, crushed beneath coffee grounds and eggshells. I thought about Brittany sipping her morning mimosa, laughing, as she declared my child a mistake, who did not deserve a celebration. They had built their entire shiny, arrogant existence on my pain and my stolen identity. They wanted to play high society games using my name. It was time to show them exactly what happens when you steal from the house. Do it, I commanded. David pressed the enter key with a sharp, satisfying click. The screen flashed bright green, confirming the transmission of the severe fraud alert to our banking syndicate. The digital guillotine had officially dropped. I leaned back in my leather chair, taking a slow sip of the fresh coffee Thomas had poured for me earlier. I checked the gold watch on my wrist. The banking freeze would propagate through the financial network and hit their personal accounts in exactly 3 minutes. The trap was set, and there was absolutely no way for them to escape it. Just as I set my coffee cup down on the saucer, the digital intercom in the center of the massive boardroom table lit up with an urgent, flashing red light. I pressed the receiver button, the quiet chime echoing in the large room. It was Sarah, the head receptionist for the executive floor. Her voice was trembling with absolute panic, a stark contrast to her usually calm and collected professional demeanor. "Ms. Cassidy, I am so incredibly sorry to interrupt your meeting," she stammered over the speaker, breathing heavily. "Security is requesting immediate backup in the main lobby downstairs. There are 2 women down here screaming at the concierge desk and causing a massive scene in front of the morning clients. They are demanding to use your employee discount to fix a venue cancellation. They say they are your mother and your sister, and they are threatening to have everyone in the building fired if you do not come down right now." "Send them up to the top floor, Sarah," I said, my voice completely level as I pressed the intercom button on the center of the massive mahogany conference table. "And have a full security detail flank the executive elevators immediately. Do not physically engage them unless they become violent, but ensure they are escorted directly into the primary boardroom." I released the button and looked across the table at David. My general counsel had just lifted his finger from the enter key on his encrypted laptop, having officially transmitted the severe fraud alert to our federal banking syndicate. The digital trap had been sprung, and the absolute timing of my mother and sister arriving in my lobby could not have been more poetic. They had marched directly into the epicenter of the empire they had just tried to defraud. David closed his laptop with a soft, definitive click. He adjusted his tailored suit jacket and leaned back in his leather chair, watching the heavy oak double doors of the boardroom, with the detached clinical fascination of a scientist observing a highly volatile chemical reaction. Thomas stood silently by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his arms crossed over his chest, his posture radiating professional outrage on my behalf. We did not have to wait long. The heavy oak doors did not simply open. They were violently shoved apart, rebounding off the soundproofed walls with a heavy thud. Patricia stormed into the room like a hurricane of synthetic perfume and misdirected rage. She was clutching her designer handbag like a weapon, her face flushed dark red beneath her expensive, expertly applied makeup. Brittany was right behind her, panting heavily. My sister was incredibly still, wearing the white silk bridal robe from her morning fitting, an absurd and highly inappropriate choice of attire for a downtown corporate high-rise. She had her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face twisted into a mask of pure vindictive fury. Neither of them seemed to notice the sheer scale of the room they had just breached. They were completely blind to the original modern art hanging on the walls, the panoramic, unobstructed view of the city skyline behind my desk, or the imposing silent presence of my senior executive team. Patricia did not see a chief executive officer sitting at the head of a multi-million-dollar holding company. Her arrogant, deeply ingrained prejudices only allowed her to see the same teenage girl she had kicked out of her home 12 years ago. She assumed I had simply borrowed a nice conference room to hide in. "I know exactly what you did," Patricia screamed, her voice echoing sharply in the cavernous space. "You marched out of my house, drove straight to your little desk job, and begged your boss to cancel your sister's wedding venue. You vindictive, jealous little brat. You are actually trying to sabotage the most important day of Brittany's life over a cheap store-bought cake." Brittany shoved her way past our mother, slamming her manicured hand onto the polished mahogany table. Jamal's mother is already arranging the rehearsal dinner details. Brittany shrieked, her voice cracking with hysteria. "Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is? We received an automated cancellation email claiming payment discrepancies. Jamal's family is flying in from Atlanta. You are going to call whoever manages your department right now and tell them it was a system error." I remained perfectly still in my chair. I did not speak. I simply let their frantic, unhinged demands fill the room, letting them dig their own graves deeper with every single word. "You will use your employee discount," Patricia commanded, marching forward and pointing a trembling finger inches from my face. "You will beg your manager to reinstate the reservation today, and you will apply your staff complimentary pass to cover the terrible inconvenience you have caused us. If you do not fix this right this second, Cassidy, I will personally call Jamal's parents. I will tell them that you are a bitter, unstable single mother who tried to ruin her own sister's wedding out of sheer jealousy because no man will ever want you." The silence that followed her threat was deafening. The ambient hum of the city traffic far below the glass windows was the only sound in the room. I looked at my mother, absorbing the absolute depth of her delusion. She truly believed she held all the power. She truly believed I was a struggling, desperate subordinate who could be bullied into compliance with the threat of social exile. I slowly stood up, placing both of my hands flat on the cool wood of the table to command the physical space of the room. I reached down and picked up the thick manila folder containing the security logs and the forged contracts. I slid it smoothly across the polished surface until it came to a halt directly against Patricia's fingertips. "I do not have a manager, Mother," I said. My voice was no longer the quiet, accommodating tone I had used my entire life to keep the peace. It was a glacial, uncompromising whisper that seemed to lower the temperature in the room. "And I certainly do not need to beg anyone for a venue reservation." Patricia stared at me, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. Her fingers slowly lowered as her brain struggled to process my complete lack of intimidation. Brittany let out a harsh, mocking laugh, tossing her hair over her silk-covered shoulder. "You do not have a manager. What are you talking about? You are completely delusional, Cassidy. You are a high school dropout who lives in a cheap apartment. You do not have the power to cancel anything unless you are sleeping with the owner." "I own the venue," I stated, my words cutting through the air like a knife. Brittany's laughter stopped instantly. "I own the Grand Oaks estate." I continued, stepping around the massive table to close the distance between us. "I own the luxury catering company you attempted to hire. I own the floral distribution network you tried to secure. In fact, I own the very building you are currently standing in. I am the founder and chief executive officer of this entire corporate hospitality group." Patricia took a slow, unsteady step backward, her eyes darting frantically around the room, finally noticing the sheer opulence of the executive suite, finally registering the presence of Thomas and David, watching them with cold authority. "Open the folder," I commanded. Patricia looked down at the table. Her trembling hands pulled the cardboard cover back. The remaining color drained from her face faster than I had ever seen before, leaving her looking completely ashen. She was staring directly at the digital contract. She was staring at her own forged version of my signature, and she was staring at my private 9-digit social security number printed in stark black ink. David stood up smoothly, buttoning his tailored suit jacket. "My name is David," he said, his voice carrying the sharp, relentless edge of a seasoned federal litigator. I am the general counsel for this corporation. What you are looking at is physical documented evidence of felony identity theft, federal wire fraud, and corporate espionage. Brittany stumbled backward, her knees hitting one of the heavy leather boardroom chairs. Her silk bridal robe suddenly looked pathetic and flimsy in the sterile corporate environment. Mom, what is he talking about? Brittany gasped, her breathing turning shallow and rapid. What did you do? What is a felony? You thought you could just use my social security number to comp a $150,000 wedding, I said, keeping my gaze locked entirely on my mother. You thought, because I never fought back when I was younger, because I let you steal my savings to buy Brittany designer clothes, that I would just quietly absorb the cost of your fraud. You assumed I was weak. You assumed I would take the fall to protect your precious reputation. Patricia tried to speak, but only a dry, rattling gasp escaped her throat. She gripped the edge of the table to keep herself upright. We did not steal it, she whispered frantically, falling back on her usual twisted justifications. We just reallocated it. You owe us for raising you. You owe us for taking care of your child. I owe you absolutely nothing, I stated, my voice echoing off the glass walls. But you currently owe the federal government an explanation. I checked the gold watch on my wrist. The timing was absolute perfection. 3 minutes ago, David officially initiated a top-tier corporate fraud investigation with our banking syndicate, I explained slowly, ensuring she understood every single word. Because your little scheme involved crossing state lines with digital wire fraud to secure an unsecured credit line, it triggered an automatic federal response protocol. I watched Patricia's eyes widen in sheer, unadulterated terror as I broke down exactly what was happening to her carefully constructed fake high society life. Every single bank account with your name on it is currently frozen, I said, leaning in closer. Your joint checking account with William, your personal savings, the home equity line of credit you used to finance Brittany's luxury car, the credit cards you linked to my corporate vendor accounts to make it look like you were paying cash. They are all completely paralyzed by the federal banking authorities. Brittany let out a loud, high-pitched wail, covering her face with her hands. You cannot buy a cup of coffee, I continued, my voice merciless and precise. You cannot put gas in your vehicle to drive home. You cannot pay your massive mortgage. You are entirely locked out of your own financial existence. And because you tied William's accounts to the vendor payouts, his assets are frozen as well. You have bankrupted your entire household in a matter of seconds. The heavy oak doors swung open behind them. 4 massive security guards in dark tailored suits stepped into the boardroom, their expressions stoic and imposing as they flanked the exit, blocking any chance of retreat. Brittany dropped to the floor, clutching the heavy metal base of the conference table as hyperventilation completely took over her body. She was sobbing uncontrollably, her pristine bridal image shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. Patricia backed away from the forged documents on the table, as if the paper itself were covered in lethal poison, her entire body shaking violently. The arrogant, untouchable high society matriarch who had callously thrown my daughter's birthday cake into the trash just hours ago was completely gone. In her place stood a terrified, financially ruined woman who had just realized she handed the daughter she abused the exact loaded weapon needed to destroy her entirely. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom remained guarded by my security detail, sealing the room in a suffocating, airtight silence. Patricia stood completely frozen, her eyes locked onto the forged contracts resting on the mahogany table, as if they were venomous snakes ready to strike. Brittany remained crumpled on the floor, her manicured hands gripping the metal base of the table, her breath hitching in ragged, panicked gasps. The impenetrable illusion of their high society superiority had just been violently shattered against the concrete wall of reality. Before either of them could formulate a coherent response, the digital chime of the private elevator echoed through the outer reception area. Heavy, hurried footsteps approached down the corridor. The security guards flanking the boardroom doors stepped aside, allowing the massive panels to swing inward once more. Jamal strode into the room, He was a striking man in his late 30s, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit carrying a leather messenger bag over one shoulder. As a highly successful commercial architect whose family possessed generational wealth in Atlanta, Jamal carried himself with a quiet, grounded confidence. He was entirely accustomed to navigating high-pressure situations, but as he stepped into my corporate boardroom and took in the bizarre scene unfolding before him, his calm demeanor vanished into pure confusion. The false victim narrative. Brittany, he said, his voice laced with absolute bewilderment, as he looked from my sobbing sister on the floor to the imposing security guards lining the walls. What on earth is happening here? I got your text message saying it was an emergency, but the front desk downstairs would not tell me anything. The moment Brittany heard his voice, a miraculous transformation occurred. The genuine terror of facing federal felony charges instantly vanished from her face, replaced by the practiced theatrical distress of a damsel in need of rescuing. She scrambled to her feet, her white silk bridal robe dragging across the polished marble floor, and threw herself directly into Jamal's arms. She buried her face in his chest, unleashing a torrent of dramatic, heart-wrenching sobs. "Jamal, thank God you are here," Brittany wailed, her voice muffled against his suit jacket. "You have to help us. Cassidy has completely lost her mind. She is having some sort of severe psychotic breakdown. She dragged us up to this random conference room and she is threatening to use her employee connections to illegally cancel our entire wedding venue. She is trying to ruin everything out of pure spiteful jealousy." Patricia, seeing an opportunity to salvage their rapidly disintegrating facade, immediately rallied behind her daughter's lie. She straightened her posture, smoothing down her designer skirt, and adopted an expression of deep maternal sorrow. "It is a tragedy," Jamal, Patricia said, pressing a hand to her chest. "We came down here to simply ask her for a favor, and she just snapped. You know how much she resents Brittany's happiness. She has locked us in here with these security guards and is ranting about destroying our family. Please, you have to talk some sense into her before she does permanent damage to her own career." Jamal wrapped his arms protectively around Brittany, stroking her hair as he looked across the massive mahogany table at me. His expression was a mixture of pity and frustration. He truly believed them. He believed the carefully constructed narrative they had fed him for 2 years, that his fiancée was the successful shining star of a wealthy family, and that I was the bitter, struggling, estranged sister who could not cope with my own failures. "Cassidy," Jamal said, his voice dropping into the soothing, reasonable tone one might use to negotiate with a volatile child. "Please let us just take a deep breath and de-escalate this situation. I understand that family dynamics can be incredibly complicated, and I know you have had a difficult life. But trying to sabotage your sister's wedding venue is not the answer. Let us dismiss these security guards, sit down, and figure out how to fix whatever mistake was made in the booking system." I did not raise my voice. I did not argue with his condescending assessment of my life. I simply stood at the head of the conference table, maintaining the cold, detached posture of a chief executive officer, observing a deeply flawed presentation. I looked at David, my general counsel, who was watching the exchange with a tight, predatory smile. Then I looked back at the man who was moments away from marrying into a family of absolute frauds, the undeniable evidence. "I am not an employee having a mental breakdown, Jamal," I said smoothly, my voice echoing with glacial authority. "I am the sole owner and chief executive officer of this entire hospitality corporation. I own the building you are standing in, and I own the Grand Oaks estate. And I am not canceling your wedding out of jealousy. I am freezing the venue because your future mother-in-law and your future bride just committed massive federal bank fraud." Jamal frowned, his protective grip on Brittany loosening slightly. He looked at me then, at the sprawling, opulent executive suite, the original artwork, and the undeniable presence of my high-level corporate legal team. The architectural reality of the space he was standing in began to conflict heavily with the lie he had been told about my lowly status. "What are you talking about?" Jamal asked, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. "What fraud? Patricia's father is paying for the venue in cash. They wired the deposit yesterday." Brittany let out a sharp, panicked gasp and attempted to pull Jamal backward toward the exit. Jamal! She is lying. She is completely insane. Do not listen to a word she says. We need to leave right now. I picked up the thick manila folder from the table and walked deliberately toward him. I bypassed Patricia, who shrank away from me as if I were a blaze, and stopped directly in front of Jamal. I held the folder out to him. You are an architect, Jamal, I stated calmly. You manage multi-million-dollar commercial contracts every single day. You know exactly what a legally binding financial document looks like. Read it for yourself. Jamal looked down at the folder. Despite Brittany frantically clawing at his arm and begging him to leave, his professional instincts took over. He gently pushed Brittany aside, reached out and took the file from my hands. He opened it, and the entire boardroom descended into a silence so profound I could hear the faint rustle of the heavy paper as he turned the pages. I watched his eyes scan the documents. I watched his sharp, analytical mind process the information. He saw the $150,000 venue contract. He saw the demand for beluga caviar, imported orchids, and top-shelf vintage champagne. And then he turned to the third page. He saw Patricia's signature. He saw the box checked for an executive owner complimentary override. He saw my private social security number printed clearly on the verification line. Finally, he turned to the credit application David had uncovered. He read the details of the $50,000 unsecured corporate line of credit fraudulently opened in my name and deliberately linked to William and Patricia's personal checking accounts. The color drained entirely from Jamal's face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly shade of gray. The files shook slightly in his hands as the horrifying reality of the situation washed over him. The illusion crumbles. They did not wire you a deposit, Jamal. I explained, my voice remaining perfectly level. My father's manufacturing business has been practically bankrupt for years. They are drowning in debt. To match the social standing of your family, Patricia stole my identity to secure your wedding venue for free. Then she opened a massive corporate credit line in my name to pay for your catering and your flowers, routing the money through her own checking account to make it look to you and your parents like they were independently wealthy benefactors. Jamal slowly lowered the folder. He turned his head to look at Brittany. The warm, protective affection that had been in his eyes just moments ago was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, devastating disgust. You told me your father was paying for this, Jamal said, his voice deathly quiet. You sat at dinner with my parents last month and bragged about your family's investment portfolio. You told me your sister was a struggling waitress who constantly begged your parents for money. Brittany's face crumpled in absolute terror. Jamal, please, she sobbed, reaching out with trembling hands to grab his suit jacket. It is not what it looks like. We just wanted the day to be perfect. My parents just hit a temporary rough patch with their cash flow. We were going to pay it back. I promise you we were going to fix it. Jamal took a sharp, deliberate step backward, ripping his jacket out of her grasp. He looked at Patricia, who was cowering near the windows, unable to make eye contact with him. You stole your own daughter's social security number, Jamal stated, addressing Patricia with absolute revulsion. You committed felony wire fraud and identity theft just to throw a party to impress my family. You are completely bankrupt, and you are going to let Cassidy take the fall for $50,000 in criminal debt. Jamal, please. Patricia begged, her voice cracking as she finally spoke. Do not tell your mother. We can resolve this quietly. We are still a good family. You are not a good family, Jamal fired back, his voice rising in anger. You are criminals. You are frauds. He turned back to Brittany. She was hyperventilating, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face, her silk robe slipping off her shoulder. I cannot marry into this, Jamal said, the finality in his tone echoing like a gavel striking wood. I cannot tie my life, my reputation, and my family's business to people who would commit federal felonies just to maintain a fake country club lifestyle. I am completely done. Do not call me. Do not contact my parents. Jamal Namaba, Brittany screamed, dropping to her knees on the marble floor. You cannot leave me. The invitations are already sent out. My dress is completely custom. You cannot do this to me. Jamal did not look back. He dropped the manila folder onto the conference table, turned on his heel, and walked out of the boardroom. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind him, sealing the final nail into the coffin of their high society delusion. The absolute eviction. The moment Jamal disappeared, Brittany completely lost her mind. The sorrow and the begging vanished, replaced by the feral, unhinged rage of a spoiled child who had just had her favorite toy taken away. She scrambled to her feet and lunged toward me, her hands curled into claws, her face twisted with pure hatred. "You ruined my life!" Brittany shrieked at the top of her lungs, spittle flying from her lips. "You planned this. You did this on purpose to destroy me because you are a miserable, lonely failure. I am going to kill you." She did not make it within 5 feet of me. The security guards moved with terrifying speed and precision. Two massive men in dark suits intercepted Brittany mid-lunge, grabbing her firmly by both arms and locking her in a rigid, immovable hold. She thrashed wildly, screaming obscenities that echoed off the glass walls, but she was completely powerless against their grip. A third guard stepped forward and clamped a heavy hand down on Patricia's shoulder. My mother gasped, her eyes wide with terror as she realized the physical reality of her complete loss of control. "Ms. Cassidy," the lead guard said, his voice calm and professional over the sound of my sister's hysterical screaming. "What are your orders?" I looked at the two women who had tormented me, belittled me, and ultimately tried to ruin me to fund their own vanity. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no remorse. I felt nothing but the clean, satisfying closure of a long overdue eviction. "Escort them out of my building," I commanded, my voice slicing through the noise. "Do not allow them to collect their vehicles from the private garage. Escort them directly to the street-level sidewalk. Their bank accounts are frozen, their credit cards are voided, and they have no cash. They can figure out how to walk home." The guards nodded in unison. They physically marched Patricia and Brittany toward the exit. Brittany fought the entire way, her screams of rage and humiliation dragging down the hallway as they forced her into the elevator. Patricia simply wept, a broken, defeated woman who had just lost her reputation, her future son-in-law, and her freedom in the span of 15 minutes. The elevator doors slid shut, cutting off the sound of their wailing. The boardroom fell perfectly silent once more. I walked over to the mahogany table, picked up my coffee cup, and took a slow, deeply satisfying sip while looking out over the sprawling city that belonged entirely to me. It was barely 8 o'clock in the morning, and the war room adjacent to my primary office was already humming with clinical-focused energy. The sprawling mahogany table was covered in printed transcripts, digital forensics reports, and heavily highlighted banking documents. David was standing at the head of the table, flanked by 3 junior litigators who were rapidly compiling physical dossiers. Thomas was on a secure line with our banking syndicate, confirming the absolute lockdown of Patricia and William's assets. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the crawling traffic of the financial district, listening to the methodical dismantling of my family's remaining leverage. "The digital footprint is staggering, Ms. Cassidy," David said, tossing a thick stack of printed social media metrics onto the table. "They haven't just posted the videos. They are actively engaging with the comments, doubling down on the accusations of embezzlement and racism. We have secured timestamps proving that the posts were uploaded mere hours after they were escorted from this building. The retaliatory intent is undeniable." I turned away from this window. "What about the extortion demand?" "I have the recorded phone call transcript synced with the corporate server," David replied, tapping his tablet. "Offering to retract defamatory public statements in exchange for financial compliance and the dropping of federal fraud alerts is a textbook violation of state and federal extortion laws. We now have them on wire fraud, identity theft, defamation, libel, and criminal extortion." "And the bank accounts?" I asked, looking toward Thomas. Thomas covered the receiver of his phone. "The freeze is absolute, Ms. Cassidy. The federal algorithms successfully blocked a sequence of automated mortgage and auto lease withdrawals at midnight. We also have logs showing Patricia attempted to access ATMs at 3 different locations early this morning. Every single transaction was flagged and denied. They had no money, they had no venue, they had no groom. All they had left was a fabricated public narrative, and they were banking their entire existence on the hope that I would shatter under the weight of social pressure. They thought the whispering PTA mothers and the hateful text messages from distant relatives would force me to capitulate. They fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the woman they were dealing with. You cannot socially destroy someone who no longer cares about your society. Draft the civil suit for defamation and emotional distress. I instructed David, my voice echoing clearly in the war room. I want the damages calculated at $10 million. It needs to be an astronomical sum that completely eclipses whatever remaining equity they have in their home, and attach the formal cease and desist order. Drafting now. David said, his fingers flying across his keyboard. Do you want me to dispatch a courier to their residence? No. I said, a cold, absolute calm settling over my shoulders. They gave me a 1-hour deadline to surrender. We are going to meet it. Have my driver bring the car around. We are going to hand-deliver the consequences to their front door. The drive to my parents' sprawling colonial estate in the affluent suburbs took 45 minutes. I sat in the back of the sleek black corporate town car, David sitting opposite me, with a leather briefcase resting on his knees. The silence between us was comfortable and sharp. As the car turned onto the familiar manicured street where I had spent my childhood, the memories of their constant belittlement tried to surface, but they found no purchase. The emotional wounds they had inflicted over the years had been completely cauterized by their actions over the last 24 hours. The town car glided to a smooth halt at the base of the sweeping circular driveway. The massive house looked exactly as it always did, imposing, pristine and dripping with the illusion of generational wealth. 2 luxury SUVs sat in the driveway, both currently in default due to the frozen accounts. I stepped out of the car, the crisp morning air catching the hem of my tailored suit jacket. David followed closely behind, his posture radiating legal authority. We walked up the wide brick pathway to the heavy double front doors. I didn't knock. I didn't ring the bell. I simply reached out and firmly pressed my thumb against the brass latch, pushing the door open. The chaotic sound of shouting hit us immediately. The foyer echoed with the frantic, high-pitched voices coming from the formal living room. The bank still isn't answering William! Patricia was shrieking, her voice bordering on hysterical. It keeps routing me to some automated fraud protection hotline. How are we supposed to pay the landscapers this afternoon? How are we supposed to buy groceries? I don't know, Patricia, my father roared back, his usually booming, confident voice laced with genuine panic. My corporate cards are declining too. Everything is locked. You said she would cave if you posted those videos. You said the social pressure would force her to drop the freeze. She will! Brittany cried out, her voice shrill and desperate. Her hour is almost up. She probably hasn't even dropped Lily off at school yet. When she sees the other mothers staring at her, she'll call the venue and beg them to fix this. She has to. I stepped out of the foyer and into the arched doorway of the living room. I dropped her off 40 minutes ago, I said calmly. The shouting ceased instantly. All 3 of them whipped their heads toward the doorway. Patricia was clutching a stack of past-due bills. William was standing near the fireplace, his face pale and sweating. Brittany was curled on the expensive white sofa, her phone gripped tightly in her hands. They stared at me, then at the towering, unsmiling presence of David standing at my shoulder. The triumphant extortionists from the phone call were completely gone, replaced by 3 people who suddenly realized the monster they had summoned was standing in their living room. Cassidy! Patricia gasped, the paperwork slipping from her hands and fluttering to the floor. What? What are you doing in my house? How did you get in here? The front door was unlocked, I replied, stepping further into the room. And I am not here to negotiate, Mother. Your hour is up. Brittany scrambled off the sofa, her eyes wide with a frantic, desperate hope. Did you fix it? She demanded, taking a step toward me. Did you call the bank? Did you reinstate the Grand Oaks? Jamal won't answer any of my calls. You need to call him right now and tell him you lied about the credit line. You need to tell him you had a mental breakdown and that you made the whole thing up. I looked at my sister, marveling at the sheer impenetrable density of her entitlement. She was standing in the wreckage of a federal financial crime, and she still believed I was there to serve her. I am not here to fix your wedding, Brittany. I stated, my voice stripping the last ounce of hope from the room. I am here to deliver the final bill. I nodded to David. He stepped forward, opening his leather briefcase with a sharp snap. He pulled out 3 thick, legally bound folders and dropped them onto the glass coffee table with a heavy thud. "Patricia and William," David said, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "You have been formally served with a $10 million civil lawsuit for defamation of character, libel, and severe emotional distress. Attached to that suit is a formal cease and desist order mandating the immediate removal of all digital media pertaining to Ms. Cassidy. Furthermore, I have been instructed to inform you that the federal banking authorities have escalated the fraud alert. Because the fraudulent $50,000 credit line crossed state jurisdictions, the FBI's Financial Crimes Division has officially taken over the investigation." William's knees buckled. He collapsed heavily into one of the velvet armchairs, his hands gripping his chest as he stared at the legal documents on the table. $10 million. William choked out, his eyes wide and unblinking. "Cassidy, we don't have $10 million. The company is leveraged to the hilt. The house is mortgaged twice over. If they don't unfreeze those accounts today, we lose the cars by Friday. We have absolutely nothing." "I know," I said, looking down at the man who had spent my entire life telling me I was a financial burden. "I know exactly how much debt you are in, Dad. Because for the last 7 years, my subsidiary holding company has been quietly buying up your defaulted medical and corporate debt to keep you out of bankruptcy. I was protecting you, and in return you let Mother steal my identity to throw a party." Patricia let out a strangled, horrified gasp, covering her mouth with both hands as the full reality of her actions finally broke through her delusion. The daughter she had mocked, alienated, and publicly smeared was the only reason they had a roof over their heads. And they had just attempted to extort her. "You have 24 hours to remove every single video and post from your social media accounts." I commanded, my gaze locking onto Patricia's terrified eyes. "You will post a formal, legally approved retraction stating that your previous claims were entirely fabricated. If you do not comply, David will submit the extortion recordings to the district attorney, and you will face prison time on top of the federal bank fraud." I didn't wait for their response. I didn't need to hear their apologies or their desperate begging. I turned around and walked out of the house, leaving the legal files resting on their coffee table, the ultimate monument to their destruction. The ride back to the financial district was conducted in a profound, comfortable silence. I stepped out of the black corporate town car and walked through the towering glass doors of my headquarters, feeling the crisp, conditioned air of my own empire wash over me. The chaotic, desperate hysteria of my parents' estate already felt like a distant, unpleasant memory. David walked precisely 1 step behind me, his leather briefcase swinging in a steady rhythm, carrying the executed service of our $10 million lawsuit. We bypassed the main reception and took the private elevator directly to the top floor. I walked into my corner office, tossing my suit jacket over the back of a leather guest chair. The panoramic view of the city skyline stretched out behind my massive glass desk, a silent testament to everything I had built from the ground up. Before I could even take my seat, my private cellular phone vibrated aggressively against the glass surface. The screen illuminated, displaying an automated transcription alert for a new 3-minute voicemail. The caller ID registered a blocked number, but I knew exactly who it was. The sheer speed of the retaliation was entirely predictable. David took a seat opposite my desk, opening his laptop. I mirrored my phone to the high-fidelity surround sound speakers integrated into the ceiling of my office. I pressed play. The audio quality was slightly distorted, crackling with heavy, panicked breathing, but my father's booming, furious voice filled the sterile executive space instantly. "You listen to me, you ungrateful, vindictive little brat!" William snarled, his voice vibrating with a toxic, unchecked rage. "I do not care what kind of fake, intimidating paperwork you drop on my coffee table. I do not care what kind of cheap suits you hire to walk into my house and threaten me. You think you are untouchable because you stumbled into some lucky money. You think you can humiliate your mother and destroy your sister's life over a simple misunderstanding." I sat perfectly still, resting my chin on my steepled fingers, listening to the man who had abandoned me attempt to reassert his imaginary dominance. "You are nothing." William continued, his volume steadily increasing until he was practically screaming into the receiver. "You are a worthless high school dropout. You always were a failure, and putting your name on a fancy building does not change what you are. I built a legacy in this city. I know the people who matter. I know every major supplier, every logistics coordinator, and every hospitality vendor in this entire state. If you do not call the bank right this second and drop these ridiculous fabricated fraud charges, I am going to make it my personal mission to destroy you. David stopped typing. He looked up from his screen, his eyes narrowing like a predator catching the scent of blood. I am going to call every single contact I have, William threatened, his voice dropping into a menacing, breathless growl. I will tell them exactly how unstable you are. I will tell them you are a bitter, psychotic single mother who cannot be trusted with corporate contracts. I will completely ruin your business reputation before the sun goes down today. You will lose every vendor you have. You will be bankrupt and crawling back to us begging for a handout, and I will gladly slam the door in your face. Drop the lawsuit, Cassidy, or I will end you. The voicemail clicked and ended, leaving a heavy, ringing silence in the massive office. I did not flinch. I did not shed a single tear. The verbal abuse that would have crushed me a decade ago now simply sounded like the pathetic dying gasps of a cornered animal. David let out a low, appreciative whistle, shaking his head as his hands hovered over his keyboard. That is remarkable, he said, his tone clinical and detached. He just explicitly outlined a premeditated plan to commit tortious interference with your business contracts. He openly stated his intent to commit corporate defamation and attempted to use those threats to coerce you into dropping a federal fraud investigation. He basically just handed us a neatly wrapped confession to witness intimidation and extortion. I reached out and gently tapped the polished glass of my desk. He is grasping at ghosts, I said quietly. He thinks he still holds the power in a dynamic that died years ago. He truly believes his reputation means something in this city. I turned my executive chair toward the massive curved monitor on my desk. I bypassed the standard corporate network and logged directly into my heavily encrypted private offshore holding server. I navigated through a labyrinth of heavily secured financial directories, pulling up archived transaction ledgers from exactly 5 years ago. Let me show you the ultimate irony of William's brilliant legacy, I said, clicking on a specific PDF document and dragging it to the large presentation screen mounted on the wall for David to see. David adjusted his glasses, squinting slightly at the digital receipt displayed in high definition. It was a wire transfer confirmation. The amount was exactly $80,000. The recipient was a highly aggressive, specialized medical debt collection agency. The origin account belonged to a blind proxy shell company that I exclusively controlled. What am I looking at here? David asked, his legal mind working to piece together the narrative. 5 years ago, I explained, leaning back in my chair, William suffered a massive arterial blockage. He required an emergency, highly specialized cardiovascular bypass surgery. The problem was that his manufacturing business was already failing. He had secretly allowed his premium health insurance policies to lapse to cover his corporate payroll. The hospital saved his life, but the resulting medical bills were astronomical. I watched the realization slowly dawn on David's face as I laid out the absolute hypocrisy of my family. $80,000 in unsecured medical debt. I continued, my voice devoid of any warmth. The collection agencies were preparing to place a lien on their colonial estate. The bank was threatening immediate foreclosure. Patricia was quietly pawning her designer jewelry just to keep the lights on. They were exactly 2 weeks away from complete, devastating bankruptcy. They were going to lose the house, the cars, and the entire high society facade they worshipped. And you paid it, David concluded, his voice hushed with a mixture of shock and profound respect. I had just sold my very first boutique hotel property, I said, staring at the digital receipt that represented my own silent, unrequited loyalty. I had the liquid capital. I knew if I handed them the money directly, Patricia would have found a way to belittle the gesture, and William would have rejected it out of pure, fragile male pride. So I routed the money through a corporate proxy. I hired an independent lawyer to contact the collection agency, settle the debt in full, and clear the arrears on their mortgage. I turned my chair back to face David. My father has spent the last 5 years boasting at his country club about a mysterious anonymous angel investor who recognized his brilliance and bailed out his family. He genuinely believes some wealthy corporate titan saved him because of his stellar reputation. He has absolutely no idea that the silent investor who saved his life and kept a roof over his head was the worthless high school dropout he just threatened to destroy. David sat back in his chair, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. The contrast between the sheer venom of the voicemail they had just heard and the quiet, life-saving generosity displayed on the monitor was staggering. It was the ultimate inescapable proof of my family's profound moral bankruptcy. Ms. Cassidy David said, his tone shifting into pure lethal litigation mode. This changes the landscape of the civil suit entirely. This changes everything. Explain, I ordered. In a standard defamation and harassment suit, opposing counsel will always try to argue that the defendant was acting out of emotional distress or familial miscommunication, David explained, gesturing to the screen. They will try to paint you as the aggressive, vindictive billionaire crushing your poor, struggling parents. But this receipt combined with his recorded voicemail destroys any possible defense they could ever mount. David stood up, pacing the length of my desk as the strategy solidified in his mind. This proves a historical pattern. It proves that you have acted with extraordinary verifiable grace and financial generosity toward them, maintaining their livelihood without asking for a single drop of recognition. In return, they stole your identity, committed federal fraud, and when caught immediately resorted to blackmail and threats of systemic corporate sabotage. When a judge hears that audio recording and then looks at this $80,000 wire transfer, they will not just rule in our favor. They will financially decimate William and Patricia. I looked at the phone resting on my desk. William thought his words were weapons. He thought he could use his deep-seated misogyny and parental authority to force me back into the tiny compliant box he had constructed for me when I was a child. He thought I would be terrified of his empty threats. Package the audio file. I said, my voice cold and uncompromising. Attach it as Exhibit A to the harassment filing. I want you to pull the sworn affidavits from our vendors immediately. If William makes a single phone call to any of my suppliers attempting to disparage this company, I want a restraining order filed before noon tomorrow. Consider it done, David replied, already typing furiously on his laptop. Do you want to include the medical debt payoff in the initial discovery packet? No, I replied, a dark, satisfying anticipation blooming in my chest. We are not going to show them the receipt in the discovery phase. We are going to wait until the inevitable deposition. I want William to sit in a recorded legal proceeding under oath. I want him to testify about his mysterious angel investor. And then I want you to hand him this document and force him to read it aloud for the court record. I want him to realize that the daughter he despises is the only reason he is not living on the street. David closed his laptop with a sharp, definitive snap. It will be the most devastating deposition in the history of this firm, he promised. I turned my attention back to the panoramic window, looking out over the city that William claimed he controlled. He had promised to ruin my reputation before the sun went down. He had promised to end me. But as the morning light reflected off the towering glass buildings of my corporate empire, I knew the absolute truth. William had just handed me the final weapon I needed to ensure my family would never ever be able to touch me again. My personal cell phone vibrated violently against the glass desktop, lighting up with a fresh wave of notifications. The retaliation was swift, entirely predictable, and breathtakingly vicious. Dozens of text messages from extended family members, distant cousins, and parents from Lily's private school poured in, all reacting to the massive coordinated social media smear campaign my mother and sister had launched overnight. Brittany had posted a tearful, highly edited video claiming I had experienced a severe, violent, psychotic break. Patricia had followed up with a lengthy, fabricated written statement across multiple platforms, alleging that I had secretly stolen money from William's business accounts years ago, and that I had maliciously canceled the wedding venue out of bitter jealousy over Brittany's happiness. To ensure maximum public outrage, they even threw in disgusting, baseless accusations, claiming I harbored deep-seated racist resentments against Jamal and his family. They were weaponizing the current social climate, attempting to paint themselves as the tragic, progressive victims of a deranged, bigoted sibling. The messages flooding my phone were toxic. Aunts and uncles I had not spoken to in a decade were demanding I seek psychiatric help immediately. The mothers from the Parent-Teacher Association were acting cold and distant, sending thinly veiled messages questioning my stability and wondering if it was safe for their children to be around me. My family was actively attempting to socially destroy me, hoping the sheer weight of public humiliation would force me to drop the federal fraud charges and reinstate the venue to save my own reputation. I reached out, pressed the power button, and slid the device into my desk drawer, locking it. I would not engage in an online shouting match. I would not post a defensive statement, release screenshots, or record a pleading video to an audience of strangers who thrive on the destruction of others. Fighting in the digital mud was exactly what Patricia and Brittany wanted. They wanted to drag me down to their level to make this a messy, emotional reality television spectacle rather than the cold, hard, documented federal financial crime it actually was. I was a chief executive officer. I dealt in leverage capital and absolute undeniable facts. I turned to David, who was busy compiling the extortion evidence from William's voicemail. Proceed with the defamation suit, I told him, keeping my voice completely devoid of emotion. But put a temporary hold on the physical service for 48 hours. I need to see the exact foundation of their war chest before we initiate the next massive legal strike. William is deeply arrogant, but he is usually not stupid enough to threaten a prolonged corporate legal war without a perceived safety net. I need to know exactly how he plans to retain a high-powered defense attorney when his accounts are locked. 40 minutes later, my security detail escorted my town car as it glided to a halt in front of the sleek steel and glass headquarters of Vanguard Financial Holdings. As one of their top-tier institutional clients, I bypassed the standard reception area entirely and was guided directly into the private soundproof suite of Evelyn Vance, the senior wealth manager who oversaw my personal and corporate portfolios. Evelyn was a sharp, fiercely intelligent woman who had helped me orchestrate the anonymous buyout of my father's medical debt 5 years ago. She understood the intricate, toxic history of my family's finances better than anyone alive. Cassidy, Evelyn said, standing to greet me with a firm, professional handshake. I saw the priority alerts flag on the system regarding the federal account freezes we initiated yesterday afternoon. The banking syndicate executed the lockdown perfectly across all institutions. William and Patricia are completely severed from the financial grid. I took a seat in the plush leather chair opposite her desk. They are threatening a massive legal retaliation, Evelyn. William claims he has the resources to destroy my business reputation and bury me in litigation. I need you to open the books on their entire estate. Since my subsidiary holding company legally owns the rights to their consolidated debt profile, I want a full, unrestrained audit of their current liquidity. I want to know exactly what they have, what they owe, and exactly how long they can survive a total financial freeze before collapsing. Evelyn nodded, her fingers flying across her mechanical keyboard as she brought up the highly restricted financial dashboard on the massive screen mounted on the wall. The numbers populated instantly, displaying a sprawling, complex, and frankly horrifying web of checking accounts, mortgages, and revolving credit lines. Let us start with the primary asset, she said, pulling up the file on the colonial estate my parents used as their ultimate high society status symbol. The property is currently appraised at $2.4 million. However, it is entirely an illusion. William and Patricia have refinanced the original mortgage 3 separate times in the last 8 years. Beyond that, they have taken out 2 maximum capacity home equity lines of credit. She highlighted a terrifyingly large number in bright red on the display screen. They currently owe $2.35 million against the house. Evelyn stated, her voice grim. They have practically zero equity. If the housing market dips even a fraction of a percent, they will be entirely underwater. The monthly payments on the mortgages and the equity lines are astronomical. I stared at the screen, feeling a cold, validating clarity wash over me. What about their liquid assets? I asked. What is currently sitting in their checking and savings accounts? Evelyn clicked to the next tab. Total combined liquidity before the federal freeze was implemented was less than $12,000. They have been living paycheck to paycheck, aggressively moving money between accounts to avoid overdraft fees. But it gets substantially worse from here. She opened a new directory, and my jaw tightened as the details of my sister's lavish lifestyle were laid bare in black and white text. Let us look at Brittany, Evelyn said, her tone laced with professional disgust. Brittany has not held a paying job in 6 years, yet she drives a $90,000 Range Rover and wears exclusively imported designer clothing. How is she funding this existence? The answer is massive high-yield personal loans. Patricia and William have co-signed on 7 different predatory lending accounts to fund your sister's fantasy lifestyle. The Range Rover is leased at an exorbitant 18% interest rate. The designer handbags, the luxury tropical vacations she posts on social media, the expensive downtown dinners, it is all financed through shadow credit cards with 29% compounding interest rates. They have been taking out new loans simply to pay the minimum balances and taxes on their old loans. And the wedding deposit they claim to have, I asked, watching the disastrous numbers scroll past. Non-existent, Evelyn replied sharply. They applied for a high-risk personal loan last week to cover the basic catering deposit, but they were firmly denied due to their catastrophic debt-to-income ratio. That is precisely why they resorted to stealing your identity and forging your signature on the corporate credit line. They were entirely out of legal options. I leaned forward, studying the horrific cascade of debt. They were drowning. They had built a spectacular, towering house of cards, held together by nothing but vanity, arrogance, and plastic credit. They are completely insolvent, I said, the absolute reality of their situation settling into place. They have no war chest. They have no hidden trust funds to fall back on. They are entirely destitute, Evelyn confirmed, closing the file and turning to face me. It is a classic, inescapable debt spiral. With their accounts currently frozen by the federal fraud investigation, they will miss every single scheduled payment this month. The mortgages, the car, leases, the high-interest personal loans, they will all default simultaneously. They are exactly one missed payment away from total ruin. I looked at the blank screen, the silence of the suite heavy with the weight of my family's impending destruction. William had left a voicemail screaming threats of annihilation. He had bragged about his legacy, his elite contacts, and his untouchable power. Brittany and Patricia were currently online attacking my character and rallying public support. But the mathematical truth was that they possessed absolutely nothing. If they try to hire a defense attorney to fight the federal fraud charges or to contest your defamation suit, Evelyn added softly, the very first thing any reputable law firm will do is run a financial background check to ensure they can pay the massive retainer required for federal court. The moment a lawyer looks at this catastrophic debt profile, they will walk away without hesitation. No one will take their case. They cannot afford a legal defense, Cassidy. They cannot even afford to keep the lights on by the end of the week. The Vanguard suite was deathly quiet, save for the rhythmic hum of the ventilation system and the rapid mechanical clicking of Evelyn's keyboard. I stood perfectly still, looking at the blank, sterile monitor on the wall, feeling a profound tectonic shift in my understanding of power. Freezing their accounts had been a defensive maneuver. It was a barricade erected to stop them from draining my corporate assets and to trigger the necessary federal alarms. But standing behind a barricade was not how I built a hospitality empire. I did not survive 12 years of psychological warfare just to leave my enemies with a fighting chance, no matter how microscopic that chance might be. Do not just observe their collapse, Evelyn. I said, the words falling into the quiet room like heavy stones. I want to control it. I want to own every single piece of paper they have signed. Evelyn paused, her hands hovering above her illuminated keyboard. She looked at me, a slow, predatory understanding sharpening her features. You want to buy their debt? All of it, I confirmed, standing up and pacing the length of the executive suite. William and Patricia have spent my entire life using money as a weapon. They used it to control me, to humiliate me, and to ensure I always knew my place at the absolute bottom of their hierarchy. My father used to withhold my meager allowance if I did not fold his laundry with mathematical precision. He demanded absolute submission because he provided the roof over my head. I want to buy that roof. I want to buy the very ground they are currently standing on. Mobilize Obsidian Holdings. Obsidian Holdings was my most heavily shielded subsidiary limited liability company. I had created it specifically for aggressive commercial acquisitions designed to move massive amounts of capital completely undetected by the general market. It was a corporate ghost, and it was about to swallow my family whole. Evelyn turned back to her terminal, her fingers moving with ruthless practice speed. The secondary debt market is currently highly volatile, she explained, her eyes darting across multiple cascading data streams. Predatory lenders, specifically the shadow credit companies financing Brittany's luxury lifestyle, hate risk. They operate entirely on the assumption of continuous high-interest minimum payments. The moment they realize a borrower is facing a federal banking freeze, they will panic. They will assume the debt is about to become entirely toxic and unrecoverable. Offer them an immediate lump sum cash buyout, I instructed, resting my hands on the back of the leather chair. Offer them 30 cents on the dollar for the unsecured personal loans and the credit card debt. Offer them face value for the primary mortgage and the home equity lines of credit. Tell the auto financiers we will absorb the entirety of Brittany's vehicle leases today. Pay whatever premium is required to expedite the transfer of the physical titles. I want this executed before the business day concludes. Consider the wheels in motion, Evelyn said, already initiating a secure communication protocol with our corporate acquisitions team. But you understand the sheer gravity of this, Cassidy. By absorbing these loans through your subsidiary, you are legally stepping into the shoes of their creditors. You will hold the primary lien on their estate. You will hold the title to the Range Rover. If they miss a single payment, you possess the absolute, unquestionable legal right to initiate immediate foreclosure and repossession proceedings. They already missed their payments. I pointed out, a cold satisfaction settling deep in my chest. The federal freeze we initiated yesterday blocked their automated midnight withdrawals. They are technically already in default. Evelyn smiled, a sharp, dangerous expression that perfectly matched the atmosphere of the room. I will have the acquisitions team prioritize the transfer of the physical deeds. We will secure the collateral by 5 o'clock. For the next 4 hours, I remained sealed inside the Vanguard executive suite, watching an absolute masterclass in corporate financial warfare. Evelyn orchestrated a relentless coordinated strike on the secondary lending market. She utilized a dozen different commercial brokers to approach my parents' lenders simultaneously, hiding the single point of origin. The predatory shadow banks that had happily funded Brittany's $90,000 vehicle and her custom-imported silk wedding dress were absolutely thrilled to dump the toxic debt the moment Obsidian Holdings flashed the cash reserves. They transferred the paper without a second thought, completely unaware that they were handing me the absolute binding chains to my family's existence. As the afternoon sun began to dip behind the neighboring skyscrapers, casting long, dramatic shadows across the glass walls of the office, the final confirmation pinged on Evelyn's terminal. She exhaled a long breath, sitting back in her chair and turning the main monitor so I could see the consolidated portfolio. "It is done," she announced, her voice ringing with finality. "Obsidian Holdings is now the sole proprietor of William and Patricia's primary mortgage. We hold both of the maximum capacity home equity lines of credit. We own the lease on Brittany's Range Rover, the loan for her custom wedding dress, and the entirety of their consolidated high-yield personal debt. You are officially their master creditor. They literally belong to you." I stared at the screen, absorbing the absolute staggering reality of the documents. The irony of the situation was almost too rich to endure. At this very moment, my mother and sister were sitting inside that heavily mortgaged colonial house, furiously typing on their phones. They were launching a massive, coordinated social media smear campaign, calling me a bitter failure, a psychotic liar, and a jealous, unstable spinster. They were desperately trying to destroy my public reputation, to force me into submission. They were completely blind to the fact that while they were composing those hateful, desperate posts, I had just legally purchased the very roof over their heads. I owned the car sitting in their driveway. I owned the silk dress hanging in Brittany's closet. I held the legal authority to evict them onto the street with a single phone call. They thought they were waging a social war, but they had already lost the war of survival. Draft the formal notices of default. I commanded, my voice calm and unwavering. Do not send them yet. I want the paperwork ready for immediate deployment the moment they cross the line from digital harassment to physical interference with my business. Keep the identity of Obsidian Holdings strictly classified. Let them panic as they receive notification that their debt has been abruptly sold to a faceless corporate entity. Let them feel the suffocating terror of not knowing who holds the axe over their necks. Evelyn nodded, securing the master portfolio into an encrypted digital vault. You have constructed a flawless trap, Cassidy. Whenever you are ready to pull the lever, their entire world will collapse in a matter of days. I thanked Evelyn for her unparalleled efficiency and left the Vanguard building, stepping out into the fading afternoon light. The air felt remarkably clean, devoid of the heavy, oppressive anxiety that had haunted my steps for the past 2 days. I slid into the quiet sanctuary of my waiting corporate town car, savoring the profound silence of victory. As the car merged seamlessly into the downtown traffic, I reached into my purse and retrieved my private cellular phone. I unlocked the screen, expecting to see a fresh barrage of hateful notifications from extended family members demanding I apologize for ruining Brittany's magical day. I was fully prepared to swipe past the endless stream of manufactured outrage. Instead, the screen was dominated by a single encrypted notification from a highly secure messaging application I rarely used outside of corporate communications. The sender was an unregistered number, but the preview text instantly caught my full attention. I opened the secure application. The message was brief, urgent, and completely unexpected. Cassidy, this is Jamal. I am using a secure line to bypass any potential interference. We need to talk immediately. Just the two of us. No lawyers, no security guards, and absolutely no family members. I need to show you something I found while dismantling the wedding contracts. Meet me at the independent coffee shop on 4th and Elm in exactly 1 hour, please. Brittany cannot know we are communicating. I stared at the glowing screen, my pulse accelerating with a sudden, sharp curiosity. Jamal had walked out of the boardroom yesterday morning with absolute, undeniable finality. He had seen the forged documents. He had recognized the depth of their fraud, and he had severed his ties with Brittany with a cold, absolute precision that I deeply respected. There was no logical reason for a man of his standing to initiate private contact with the sister of the woman who had just tried to scam his entire family, unless he had uncovered something far worse than a forged catering contract. I looked at the driver through the partition. Change of destination, I instructed, my voice tight with anticipation. Take me to the coffee shop on 4th and Elm, and make sure we are not being followed. The black corporate town car navigated the labyrinth of downtown traffic, pulling to a smooth halt at the corner of 4th and Elm just as the streetlights began to flicker on against the twilight. The coffee shop was a small, independent establishment, intentionally obscure and entirely devoid of the high society clientele my family desperately courted. It was the perfect place to remain invisible. I stepped out of the vehicle, instructing my driver to circle the block and maintain a discreet perimeter. The bell above the door chimed softly as I entered the dimly lit cafe. The air smelled heavily of roasted beans and damp rain. I scanned the sparse room and immediately spotted Jamal sitting in a secluded booth in the far back corner. The man who had commanded the Vanguard boardroom with absolute, unwavering authority yesterday morning was entirely gone. Jamal looked physically wrecked. He was wearing a dark, uncharacteristically wrinkled pullover. His shoulders were slumped, his posture radiating a bone-deep exhaustion, and the dark circles under his eyes spoke of a man who had not slept a single second since walking out of my headquarters. A thick manila folder rested on the table in front of him, his hands clasped tightly over it. I slid into the wooden booth opposite him. I did not offer any superficial pleasantries. The gravity of the situation required absolute directness. "You look like you have been to war, Jamal," I said quietly, keeping my voice low to ensure absolute privacy. "I feel like I just woke up from a psychological hostage situation," Jamal replied, his voice rough and depleted. He rubbed a hand over his face, letting out a long, shuddering breath. "I turned my phone off 24 hours ago. Brittany has been calling my personal assistant, my business partners, and even my mother, sobbing hysterically and claiming the federal fraud investigation is a massive vindictive lie orchestrated by you." "I know," I stated flatly. "They are currently attempting to incinerate my reputation across every social and professional platform they can reach. It is a desperate, calculated distraction." Jamal looked at me, his eyes dark with a mixture of profound regret and lingering disbelief. The forged credit line was the catalyst, Cassidy. It was the undeniable physical proof I needed to finally walk away. But it was not the actual reason I reached out to you today. The fraud just finally broke the spell and allowed me to see the absolute terrifying reality of the people I was about to bind my life to. He leaned forward, his hands tightening into fists on the tabletop. "You need to understand what it has been like behind closed doors with your parents. For the last 2 years, I have been subjected to a relentless, suffocating campaign of passive-aggressive microaggressions. William and Patricia hide behind their country club smiles and their polished suburban manners, but their prejudice is woven into every single interaction." I remained perfectly still, allowing him the space to speak the truth he had been forced to swallow for entirely too long. It was constant. Jamal continued, a bitter edge bleeding into his tone. William would make these subtle, incredibly condescending remarks about my family's wealth. He would disguise them as compliments, calling our success impressive for people from our background, or marveling at how articulate and well-educated I was. Patricia would ask deeply offensive, invasive questions about my heritage, cloaked in this sickening fake curiosity. They constantly implied that my family's money was somehow less legitimate, less refined than their generational wealth. They treated me like an interesting, exotic accessory that Brittany had acquired to make herself look progressive. "And Brittany," I prompted, knowing exactly how my sister operated. Jamal let out a hollow, humorless laugh. "Brittany was the ultimate architect of my insanity. Every single time I confronted her about her parents' blatant racism and classism, she completely dismissed me. She would look at me with wide, innocent tears in her eyes and tell me I was being overly sensitive. She would swear up and down that William and Patricia were just old-fashioned and that I was intentionally misunderstanding their traditional ways. She gaslit me every single day, making me feel like I was the one actively looking for reasons to be offended, making me believe I was trying to sabotage our relationship. She weaponized your own empathy against you," I said, my voice hardening with an icy, familiar rage. "She made you question your own reality so she could maintain her comfortable illusion." I felt like I was losing my mind, Cassidy. I genuinely believed I was the problem until I sat in your office and saw the absolute criminal entitlement staring back at me. Jamal looked up, searching my face for validation. "Please tell me I am not crazy. Please tell me the people I have been dealing with are exactly the monsters I think they are." "You are not crazy, Jamal," I said, leaning across the table and locking my gaze with his. "You have been dealing with professional manipulators, but you are missing the most crucial piece of the puzzle. You are evaluating their prejudice under the assumption that they actually possess the elite status they project. They do not." Jamal frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What do you mean?" I stripped away the facade, dismantling the illusion my parents had spent decades constructing. "Their entire existence is a fabrication, Jamal. The old money they constantly lord over your family is completely non-existent. William and Patricia are financially destitute. They are living on the absolute precipice of total bankruptcy." I watched the shock register on Jamal's face as I laid out the brutal, unvarnished truth. "Their sprawling colonial estate is mortgaged to the hilt." I continued my words, clinical and precise. "They have drained every ounce of equity from their properties. Brittany's luxury cars, her designer wardrobe, the extravagant tropical vacations she parades on social media, every single piece of her high society lifestyle is funded by a catastrophic web of high-interest predatory loans. They are financial parasites. They have been living off borrowed money and stolen credit for years. The only reason William did not lose his house 5 years ago is because I secretly bought his defaulted medical debt to keep him out of federal court. Jamal sat back in the booth staring at me as if the floor had just dropped out from beneath him. He was completely speechless. They projected an air of superiority toward your family because they are deeply pathetically insecure, I explained. They look down on your wealth because it is real, earned, and tangible. Their wealth is nothing but an illusion maintained by plastic credit and criminal desperation. You are not just marrying into a prejudiced family, Jamal. You are tying your pristine financial legacy to a sinking ship of career criminals. A heavy, absolute silence fell over the small booth. The lingering doubts and the residual guilt Jamal had been carrying completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, hardened disgust. The man who had been gaslit for 2 years finally saw the full, horrifying picture. He let out a long, slow breath, looking down at the manila folder resting between his hands. "That brings me to why I asked you to meet me here," he said, his voice dropping into a register of pure, focused corporate hostility. "After I walked out of Vanguard yesterday, I ordered my personal security team to sweep the luxury apartment Brittany and I shared. I instructed them to pack her belongings and secure all of my private documents." He flipped the folder open and rotated it toward me. While they were packing her home office, they found a hidden compartment in her desk. She kept a secondary file on the wedding expenses. I started digging through the vendor contracts and the venue applications. I looked down at the documents illuminated by the dim overhead light. They were loan applications. Massive, aggressive commercial credit applications submitted to multiple shadow banking institutions. "Look at the guarantor signature lines," Jamal instructed, pointing a steady finger at the bottom of the pages. My eyes scanned the fine print, and a lethal absolute fury ignited in my veins. Brittany and William had not just forged my name on the initial catering deposit. They had acquired Jamal's private social security number and his family's corporate tax identification codes from the joint wedding venue applications. They had filled out nearly $500,000 in high-risk credit applications, listing Jamal's family estate as the primary collateral. "They were preparing to execute a massive secondary fraud campaign against you," I said, tracing the forged signatures with my index finger. "They were going to wait until the marriage certificate was legally binding, and then they were going to drop this debt directly onto your family's ledger." Jamal nodded, his jaw set in a rigid line of absolute determination. "They were going to use my name to bail out their entire sinking ship. If I had walked down that aisle, my family would have been legally tethered to their criminal enterprise." He closed the folder, pushing it across the table until it rested directly in front of me. "I am not just walking away, Cassidy. I am going to salt the earth behind me. I want them prosecuted to the absolute fullest extent of the law. This folder contains every single forged application, every piece of stolen data, and a sworn affidavit from my legal team confirming the theft of my corporate identity." I placed my hand over the folder, feeling the sheer, unadulterated leverage resting beneath my palm. "You understand what happens when I hand this to my attorneys?" I asked. "This elevates the situation from a regional wire fraud dispute into a massive multi-jurisdictional federal crime. William, Patricia, and Brittany will face mandatory prison sentences." "I am counting on it," Jamal replied, standing up from the booth. His exhaustion had been entirely replaced by a fierce, commanding resolve. "My corporate attorneys have already been briefed. They are fully at your disposal. Whatever your legal team needs to bury them, you have my absolute, unwavering cooperation. Destroy them, Cassidy. Destroy the entire illusion." I watched Jamal turn and walk out of the coffee shop, leaving the devastating evidence resting on the table. My family had played a desperate, reckless game of survival, assuming they were the smartest predators in the room. They had entirely underestimated the monsters they had provoked. Jamal had just turned his back, taking a single heavy step away from the wooden booth when the brass bell above the cafe entrance clattered with violent aggression. The sound sliced through the quiet atmosphere of the coffee shop like a warning siren. Jamal froze. Through the frosted glass of the front window, the unmistakable, imposing silhouettes of my parents materialized against the evening streetlights. I did not panic. I simply locked eyes with Jamal and gave a sharp, definitive flick of my head toward the deep shadows of the rear corridor. He understood instantly. With the silent, fluid motion of a man accustomed to avoiding corporate espionage, Jamal took 2 large steps backward, melting entirely into the darkened alcove leading to the restrooms. He was completely obscured from the main floor, yet perfectly positioned to hear every single syllable spoken in the room. The heavy glass door swung open with unnecessary dramatic force. William marched inside, his chest puffed out in a pathetic display of manufactured dominance. Patricia flanked him, her eyes darting around the sparsely populated cafe like a predatory bird searching for prey. It took her exactly 3 seconds to spot me sitting alone in the corner booth, the thick manila folder of their forged loan applications resting innocuously on the table in front of me. The manic, desperate energy radiating from them was palpable. They had lost their federal funding, their shadow loans had been bought out by a mysterious corporate entity, and their entire financial existence was currently circling the drain. Yet, true to form, Patricia instantly plastered a grotesque syrupy smile across her face the moment she saw the barista glancing in her direction. She was determined to maintain her high society performance, even as her world burned to the ground. They marched across the distressed hardwood floor, their expensive shoes echoing loudly in the quiet space. William planted his hands firmly on the edge of my table, looming over me in an attempt at physical intimidation. "How on earth did you find me here?" I asked, my voice flat, cold and entirely devoid of the fear he so desperately wanted to see. William let out a harsh, arrogant scoff, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored jacket. "You really think we would let a liability like you out of our sight? We placed a military-grade GPS tracker on the undercarriage of your corporate town car 6 months ago. A good father always watches his investments, Cassidy. We needed to know exactly where you were going, who you were meeting with, and what kind of leverage we might need to use against you." I sat perfectly still, my hands resting calmly on the table. The absolute casual criminality of stalking my vehicle for half a year barely registered over the sheer magnitude of their stupidity. They had tracked me directly into an execution chamber of their own making. Patricia stepped forward dramatically, placing a manicured hand over her heart. She pitched her voice loudly, ensuring her words carried across the room to the barista and the 2 college students studying in the opposite corner. She was weaponizing her maternal charm, attempting to paint a public masterpiece of forgiveness. "Cassidy, darling," Patricia announced, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness and faux concern. "We are here to bring this family back together. We know you have been under a tremendous amount of stress lately. Running a business is so taxing on a single woman, and we understand that your little outburst yesterday was simply a cry for help." I looked at my mother, marveling at her unbreakable commitment to the delusion. "We are willing to offer you an olive branch," Patricia continued, leaning closer, her heavy perfume washing over the table. "Brittany has an incredibly forgiving heart. She is willing to overlook the malicious things you have done. In fact, as a special favor to you, we have decided to let Lily be a flower girl in the wedding. It would be such a beautiful moment for her to experience true family unity." She paused, letting her grand, magnanimous offer hang in the air before delivering the inevitable condition. "All you have to do in return is call the federal banking authorities right now." Patricia instructed, her smile tightening at the corners. "You just need to tell them you made a silly little mistake, drop the fraud charges entirely, and reinstate the credit line for the venue. We can put this whole ugly misunderstanding behind us, Cassidy. We can be a family again." They were offering my daughter a background role in their fabricated vanity project in exchange for me absorbing a massive financial crime. The sheer density of their entitlement was breathtaking. I looked down at the manila folder containing the proof of their attempt to defraud Jamal. I looked back up at William, deciding it was time to close the jaws of the trap. I leaned forward, clasping my hands together, projecting the image of a woman considering a negotiation. So I said, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet cafe. "You want me to drop the federal investigation. You want me to just erase the fact that you stole my identity. Let us be absolutely clear for the record. You are sitting here admitting that you forged my signature to steal $150,000. William rolled his eyes, utterly exasperated by my demand for accountability. He stood up straight, projecting his voice with absolute staggering arrogance. "We did not steal a single dime from you." William scoffed loudly, ensuring his dominance was established. "We reallocated funds that rightfully belong to this family. You have hoarded wealth while your sister suffered. You owe us that money, Cassidy. You owe us for putting a roof over your head, and you absolutely owe us for raising your mistake of a daughter when you were too busy playing corporate executive to be a real mother." The words hung in the air, toxic and vile. I did not flinch. I did not need to. A slow, heavy footstep echoed from the darkened corridor to my left. The shift in the atmosphere was instantaneous. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. William and Patricia turned their heads toward the sound, their expressions shifting from smug superiority to mild annoyance, expecting a barista to interrupt their extortion attempt. Jamal stepped out of the heavy shadows and into the warm light of the cafe. Patricia let out a sharp, strangled gasp. Her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes widening to the point of absolute, unadulterated terror. The syrupy high society mask she had worn for decades shattered into a million irreparable pieces. William took a stumbling step backward. His jaw went completely slack, his face draining of all color until he looked like a freshly exhumed corpse. He tried to speak, but only a pathetic, breathless wheeze escaped his throat. Jamal stood entirely still. The exhaustion I had seen in him earlier was gone, replaced by a cold, radiating aura of absolute authority. He looked at my parents not as future in-laws, but as the parasitic criminals they truly were. He looked at William with a level of pure, unbridled disgust that stripped away every ounce of my father's manufactured dignity. William Jamal said, his voice deadly quiet and cutting through the silence like a scalpel. "You do not reallocate funds, you commit federal wire fraud, and you certainly do not speak about a child in that manner." Patricia stammered, her voice shaking violently as she reached a trembling hand out toward him. "Jamal, please, you do not understand. She is lying. Cassidy manipulated this. We were just joking. It is a family dynamic, you know how we are." Jamal ignored her completely. He did not spare her a single glance. He kept his eyes locked firmly on William, delivering the absolute crushing blow to their entire social climbing existence. "The wedding is permanently off," Jamal stated, the finality in his words ringing like a gavel strike. "Do not attempt to contact me. Do not attempt to contact my family. My corporate attorneys have already been instructed to forward every single piece of evidence to the district attorney." He did not wait for an apology. He did not wait for their desperate begging. Jamal turned on his heel and walked straight out the front doors of the cafe, the brass bell chiming a cheerful mocking tune as he exited their lives forever. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Patricia was weeping openly, her hands covering her face as the reality of her social and financial annihilation finally crushed her. But William did not weep. The realization that everything was gone, the money, the status, the rich son-in-law, and the entire fabricated legacy he had built, caused something inside his arrogant mind to completely snap. The pale shock on his face instantly morphed into a violent mottled purple. The veins in his neck bulged against his expensive collar. "You did this!" William roared, spit flying from his lips as he turned his manic, bloodshot eyes back to me. "You planned this. You set us up." He lunged across the wooden table, his large hands reaching out violently toward my throat. He never even made it halfway. The front door of the cafe burst open with an explosive crash. Thomas, my lead security detail, who had been standing guard precisely outside the front window, moved with the terrifying kinetic speed of a trained operative. In a fraction of a second, Thomas crossed the distance, stepping between me and the table. He grabbed William by the lapels of his tailored jacket and the center of his collarbone, using my father's own forward momentum against him. With a singular, devastating shove, Thomas launched William backward. My father flew through the air, crashing violently into a display of retail coffee beans before collapsing onto the hardwood floor in a tangled, humiliating heap. Thomas stood over him, smoothing his own suit jacket, his posture radiating a lethal promise. "Do not move." Thomas ordered, his voice dangerously low. Patricia shrieked, dropping to her knees beside her husband, frantically checking him for injuries while sobbing hysterically. William scrambled backward, pressing himself against the wall of the cafe. His chest heaved as he stared up at the towering presence of my security guard. But his rage could not be silenced. He pointed a trembling, furious finger at me from the floor. "I will destroy your company!" William screamed, his voice cracking with pure impotent hysteria, echoing off the walls of the quiet cafe. "You hear me? I will burn your empire to the ground. I know your suppliers. I know your board members. I will tell them exactly what kind of monster you are. I will ruin you." I stood up slowly from the booth, picking up the manila folder containing the forged loan documents. I looked down at the man, screaming from the floor, entirely unfazed by his empty, pathetic threats. William was completely broken, and it was finally time to show him who actually held the strings to his life. The sheer, unadulterated arrogance of my father was a phenomenon that constantly defied logic. He had been thrown across a coffee shop floor, his financial ruin had been explicitly detailed, and his prospective billionaire son-in-law had permanently severed ties. Yet his bruised ego demanded immediate retaliation. He genuinely believed that his outdated superficial country club connections carried more weight than my absolute documented ownership of my own company. At precisely 8 o'clock the following morning, my encrypted corporate tablet chimed with an emergency high-priority alert. David walked into my office, his expression a mixture of professional disbelief and dark amusement. "He actually did it," David said, dropping a crisp, single-page legal document onto my glass desk. William spent the entire night calling in every single favor he had left in this city. He reached Marcus Thorne and Richard Sterling. I stared at the document. Marcus and Richard were two of William's oldest golf partners. During the early days of my hospitality group, when I was aggressively seeking capital expansion, they had purchased a combined 15% of minority shares. They had been silent, hands-off investors for 7 years, happily collecting their substantial quarterly dividends while I did all the heavy lifting. Now, at William's frantic urging, they had formally initiated an emergency board meeting to call for a vote of no confidence to freeze me out of my own executive position. They cited severe mental instability, erratic personal behavior, and a malicious disregard for corporate optics, David read from the filing, crossing his arms. William convinced them that your actions regarding the wedding were the result of a violent psychotic break and that you were currently a massive liability to the brand. He intends to attend the meeting as a proxy consultant for Marcus. I leaned back in my chair, steepling my fingers. He is attempting a hostile boardroom coup using men who only care about their dividend checks. Have security clear the primary conference room. Let us give them exactly what they want. The atmosphere in the executive boardroom was thick with an unearned, condescending tension. Marcus and Richard sat on one side of the sprawling mahogany table, wearing matching expressions of deep paternal concern. William sat between them, wearing an off-the-rack suit he had likely pulled from the back of his closet, his chest puffed out in a pathetic display of returning authority. He refused to look me in the eye, staring instead at the polished wood surface, as if he had already won. Cassidy Marcus began, his voice taking on a sickeningly gentle, patronizing tone as I took my seat at the head of the table. "We have known you since you were a child. We have always supported your little ventures. But William came to us last night in tears. He told us everything. He told us about your erratic behavior, your sudden cruelty toward your sister, and the disturbing fabricated legal threats you have been levying against your own parents." Richard chimed in, nodding gravely. "A chief executive officer cannot operate under this level of psychological distress. We have a fiduciary duty to protect the brand. We are calling for an immediate leave of absence and a temporary transfer of executive power until you undergo a full psychiatric evaluation." I did not interrupt them. I let them lay out their entire incredibly foolish narrative. When the room finally fell silent, I looked directly at my father. "Are you quite finished?" I asked, my voice cutting through the heavy air like a razor. William finally looked up, a triumphant smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "It is for your own good, Cassidy. You are sick. You need help." I gave a short, sharp nod to David, who was standing quietly by the door. David moved with ruthless efficiency, walking around the table and dropping 3 thick black, legally bound dossiers directly in front of each man. "Gentlemen," I said, leaning forward and resting my forearms on the table, "you are attempting to stage a corporate coup based entirely on the emotional testimony of a man you play golf with. That is an astonishingly reckless way to handle your investments. I suggest you open the folders." Marcus frowned, flipping open the heavy cover. Richard did the same. "You will find a certified copy of a federal police report," I stated, my voice echoing in the dead silence of the room. "You will also find high-resolution copies of forged commercial loan applications, fraudulent credit lines, and identity theft documentation totaling nearly $500,000. The man sitting between you did not come to you out of paternal concern. He came to you because he is currently the primary target of a massive federal wire fraud investigation, and he is desperate to silence the primary witness." The color instantly drained from Marcus's face as his eyes scanned the undeniable, stamped federal documents. Richard flipped to the next page, his breathing becoming shallow. William sat perfectly still, the triumphant smirk completely vanishing. But I did not stop there. I picked up a small remote from the table and pressed a single button. The boardroom's integrated surround sound system crackled to life, playing the exact, unedited audio recording of William's manic voicemail from yesterday morning. His own voice filled the room, screaming threats of extortion, bragging about his intent to commit corporate defamation, and promising to destroy my company if I did not drop the fraud charges. The audio cut out, leaving a suffocating, heavy dread in its wake. He tried to extort me. I continued staring dead into Marcus's terrified eyes. He threatened to sabotage this exact company, and you, in your infinite wisdom, brought him into my boardroom and handed him a microphone. Marcus swallowed hard, pushing the folder away as if it were radioactive. "Cassidy, we had absolutely no idea. William told us this was a family dispute over a wedding venue." "He lied to you," I said coldly. "Just like he lied to his country club friends about how he paid off his massive medical debt 5 years ago. Turn to the final page in your packet." They turned the page, staring at the proxy wire transfer receipt, proving that my subsidiary holding company had bailed William out of absolute bankruptcy. "You tied your financial wagons to a career criminal who has been living off my charity for half a decade," I said, delivering the final crushing blow. "Furthermore, you seem to have fundamentally forgotten the structural reality of this enterprise. I hold a controlling 60% of the voting shares. Your motion of no confidence is legally and mathematically impossible. It is denied." I stood up from the table, looking down at the 3 ruined men. "Marcus. Richard, you are hereby stripped of your advisory board privileges. My legal team will be initiating a hostile, non-negotiable buyout of your minority shares by the end of the business day. You will take the market value, and you will walk away quietly. If you attempt to contest this, I will personally ensure that every major financial institution in this city sees the extortion tape and knows you actively collaborated with a federal fraud suspect to sabotage a corporate entity." They did not argue. They did not say a single word. They simply nodded, standing up on shaky legs. "As for you, William," I said, turning my gaze to my father, who was staring blankly at the wall, completely paralyzed by his own annihilation. "Your name is now poison in this city. Every single contact you bragged about calling will receive a summary of your federal charges before noon. You are blacklisted. David, have security escort this man out of my building. If he ever steps foot on this property again, have him arrested for trespassing." David stepped forward, grabbing William roughly by the arm and hauling him out of the chair. My father did not fight back. He looked completely and utterly broken as he was dragged out of the room, his entire fabricated legacy reduced to absolute ashes. By Friday evening, the sheer psychotic delusion of my mother and sister reached a terrifying crescendo. Despite Jamal permanently ending the relationship, despite the federal fraud charges looming over their heads, and despite the absolute destruction of their financial standing, Patricia and Brittany refused to accept reality. They were operating in a state of frantic, aggressive denial. David stood in my office reading from a tablet. They are actually going through with it, he reported, his voice laced with genuine disbelief. Patricia sent out an urgent mass text to the extended family and Jamal's parents. She claimed there was a minor miscommunication with the original venue due to a malicious clerical error on your part. She told them the wedding is still happening, but they are hosting a makeshift rehearsal dinner tonight at the Oak Creek Country Club. Oak Creek was a mid-tier aging golf facility on the edge of the suburbs. It was a desperate downgrade from the luxury they demanded, but it was all they could afford to secure on an hour's notice. What is their narrative regarding Jamal? I asked, pulling my crimson designer suit jacket from the coat rack. Brittany is telling everyone he has a severe case of pre-wedding jitters and is taking the night to rest, David replied. They are literally lying to his own parents, trying to trap them in a room and force a public reconciliation through sheer social pressure. Have the car brought around, I said, sliding my arms into the tailored crimson jacket. We are going to a dinner party. Dinner. The banquet hall of the Oak Creek Country Club smelled faintly of old carpet and cheap floral arrangements. When I walked through the double oak doors, the room was buzzing with the confused, anxious chatter of 50 extended family members and Jamal's horrified-looking parents. The moment my crimson heels clicked against the hardwood floor, the room went dead silent. The clinking of silverware stopped. Every head turned to stare at me. Brittany, standing near the buffet line in a white cocktail dress, dropped her champagne flute. The glass shattered against the floor, mirroring the absolute panic tearing across her face. Patricia, however, reacted with the violent, aggressive fury of a cornered animal. She abandoned her conversation with Jamal's mother and marched directly toward me, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "How dare you show your face here!" Patricia shrieked, her voice echoing painfully in the quiet hall. "You vindictive, psychotic monster! You ruined my daughter's venue. You drove her fiancé away with your lies. You are not welcome here." She turned wildly toward the double doors, waving her hands in a manic frenzy. "Manager! Security! I want this deranged woman physically thrown out of this building immediately." Arthur, the aging, deeply nervous general manager of the country club, hurried into the room. He was sweating profusely, clutching a clipboard to his chest, as he looked frantically between my screaming mother and my perfectly calm demeanor. "Arthur," Patricia commanded, pointing a shaking finger directly at my chest. "Call the police and have this woman removed for trespassing. She is ruining a private paid event." Arthur stopped walking. He swallowed hard, adjusting his glasses. He looked at Patricia, and then he looked at me, a profound, terrified respect shining in his eyes. "I am terribly sorry, ma'am," Arthur said, his voice trembling slightly, "but I cannot do that." "Why not?" Patricia screeched, her voice breaking into a hysterical register. "We paid for this room." Arthur took a deep breath, clutching his clipboard tighter. "Because, ma'am, Ms. Cassidy finalized the corporate acquisition of our parent management company at 9 o'clock this morning." I smiled, a slow, predatory expression that caused the last remaining ounce of color to drain from Patricia's face. "I cannot be thrown out, mother," I said, my voice carrying clearly to every single stunned guest in the room. "Because I own the building you are currently standing in." The absolute paralyzing silence that washed over the banquet hall was a physical entity. It settled over the cheap floral arrangements and the stained carpets of the Oak Creek Country Club, suffocating the last remaining breaths of my family's fabricated legacy. Patricia stood frozen, her arms still extended toward the general manager, her finger pointing at absolutely nothing. Her jaw hung slack, completely unhinged by a reality her mind simply refused to process. Arthur, the manager, took 2 hurried steps backward, practically melting into the patterned wallpaper to distance himself from the impending blast radius. I did not break eye contact with my mother as I walked slowly, deliberately toward the center of the room. The sea of extended family members parted instantly, giving me a wide, uncontested berth. I could see my aunts, uncles, and cousins staring at me in sheer, unadulterated shock. They had spent their entire lives listening to Patricia and William paint me as the unstable, jealous failure of the family. Now they were watching the supposed failure walk into the room wearing a custom-tailored crimson suit, holding the deed to the very ground beneath their feet. I reached the main buffet table where Brittany was still staring blankly at the shattered remains of her champagne flute. I unclasped the brass lock of my leather portfolio. The sharp click echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. I reached inside and retrieved a thick, heavily bound stack of legal documents. I raised them slightly, allowing the stark black lettering of the legal headers to catch the light, and then I dropped them onto the center of the table with a heavy, devastating thud. These are the formal immediate notices of default and foreclosure for your colonial estate, I announced, projecting my voice so that every single person in the banquet hall could hear the absolute, unvarnished truth. Beside them are the immediate repossession orders for your Mercedes sedan and Brittany's customized Range Rover. And beneath that is the finalized acquisition portfolio containing every single one of your high-risk predatory shadow loans. I turned my gaze slowly sweeping across the horrified faces of the extended family before locking eyes with Jamal's parents. They were standing near the bar, their expressions frozen in a mixture of profound shock and rising aristocratic fury. They had been dragged to this cheap suburban country club under the guise of a rehearsal dinner, fed a sickeningly sweet narrative about pre-wedding jitters, and subjected to my mother's hysterical screaming. Now they were seeing the absolute, undeniable proof of the grift. I looked back at Patricia, whose face had drained of all color until it matched the cheap white tablecloth. Jamal is not suffering from pre-wedding jitters, I stated, my voice ringing with icy authority. He permanently canceled this wedding because he discovered that you forged his social security number to secure $500,000 in fraudulent commercial credit. And his family is not paying for your catering tonight. I am. Because I own your debt. I own everything you have. Jamal's father, a man of immense quiet dignity, stepped forward. He did not yell. He did not lose his temper. He simply looked at William and Patricia with a level of pure, concentrated disgust that stripped away the last remaining shreds of their humanity. "You are absolute monsters," Jamal's father said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "You attempted to chain my son to a criminal enterprise. You lied to our faces for 2 years. Do not ever attempt to speak our names again." He placed a protective hand on his wife's lower back, and together, without a single backward glance, they walked out of the banquet hall. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind them, sealing my family's fate. The sound of those doors closing broke the final fragile thread holding Brittany together. The realization that her entire future had just evaporated, the wealthy husband, the luxury status, the endless stream of stolen credit, finally crashed down upon her. Brittany let out a harrowing guttural sob and dropped straight to her knees. She collapsed right into the puddle of spilled champagne, her white cocktail dress soaking up the cheap alcohol. She covered her face with her hands, weeping with the frantic, entirely selfish despair of a woman who realized the world would no longer fund her delusions. William could not handle it. The public humiliation, the loss of his precious social standing, and the absolute destruction of his ego caused his mind to snap. He pushed past a terrified cousin, his face flushed a violent mottled purple, his fists balled at his sides. "You ungrateful, vindictive liability," William screamed, spit flying from his lips as he charged toward the center table. "You think you can humiliate us in front of our family? You think you can walk in here and take what is ours?" I did not step back. I did not flinch. I stood my ground, staring down the man who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small. "You have nothing that is yours, William," I countered, my voice cutting through his hysteria like a serrated blade. "Every single thing you possess was bought with stolen money, forged signatures, and lies. You spent 30 years prioritizing a toxic illusion over your own blood. You belittled me, you mocked me, you tried to legally extort me." I stepped closer to him, closing the distance until I could see the absolute pathetic terror hiding behind his rage. "Just 3 days ago, you stood in my kitchen and threw my daughter's 12th birthday cake into the trash." I said, my words dropping like anvils. "You told me I was a failure. You told me my child was a mistake. You threw her cake away to prove your dominance. But look at you now, William. You threw my daughter's cake in the trash, but you threw your own lives away." William opened his mouth to scream again, but the words died in his throat. He looked around the room desperately seeking a single sympathetic face among the extended family. He found none. His brothers, his sisters, his nieces, and his nephews were all staring at him with undisguised horror. The illusion was dead. The emperor had no clothes, and the entire kingdom was watching him shiver. I turned my back on them. I did not wait for security. I did not wait for apologies. I walked back down the center aisle of the banquet hall, the sound of my heels echoing against the floor. As I pushed through the double oak doors and stepped out into the cool evening air, I took a deep cleansing breath. The suffocating weight I had carried for my entire existence was completely gone. 1 month later, the inevitable absolute reality of the law descended upon the colonial estate in the suburbs. I did not attend the eviction, but David provided a comprehensive, incredibly satisfying report. Federal marshals arrived precisely at dawn, armed with a mountain of evidence provided by both my legal team and Jamal's corporate attorneys. William and Patricia were led out of their heavily mortgaged home in handcuffs, their faces shielded by their jackets, as local news crews documented their spectacular downfall. They were facing multiple counts of federal wire fraud, identity theft, and corporate extortion. The shadow lenders seized the luxury vehicles before noon, leaving the driveway completely barren. Brittany's reality check was equally severe, stripped of her stolen credit lines and abandoned by her entire social circle. The moment her family's criminal charges went public, she was forced into absolute unvarnished survival mode. The woman who had demanded a $90,000 wedding dress was now working a minimum wage shift at a suburban retail outlet, wearing a polyester uniform and serving the very people she used to mock. She had no rich husband to save her, no parents to bail her out, and no illusion left to hide behind. They were entirely, utterly isolated. The transition from that toxic history to my present reality was breathtaking. The scene shifted to the sprawling, manicured grounds of the Grand Oaks Estate, my flagship luxury property. The evening air was warm and fragrant, carrying the scent of blooming jasmine and roasted cedar. Soft golden fairy lights were strung through the massive ancient oak trees, casting a magical luminous glow over the private courtyard. It was Lily's belated 12th birthday party, and it was absolutely magnificent. The courtyard was filled with genuine laughter. My colleagues, my closest friends, and the dedicated team that helped me build my company were all in attendance. There were no forced polite conversations, no passive-aggressive whispers, and absolutely no tension. It was a space filled entirely with authentic, unconditional love. I stood near the edge of the stone patio, holding a glass of sparkling water, watching my daughter. Lily was glowing. She was surrounded by her friends from school, laughing hysterically as a hired magician fumbled a card trick for their amusement. She was safe, she was cherished, and she was completely free from the toxic shadows that had haunted my own childhood. Jamal stood a few feet away, engaged in an animated, genuinely joyful conversation with David. Jamal had attended the party simply as an invited friend. There was no lingering awkwardness between us, only a deep mutual respect forged in the fires of a shared crisis. He had found his closure, and he had graciously accepted my invitation to celebrate a milestone with people who actually valued truth and integrity. David caught my eye and raised his glass in a silent, respectful toast. I smiled, raising my glass in return. A massive custom-designed 4-tier chocolate cake was carefully wheeled out into the center of the courtyard. The pastry chef had outdone himself, decorating the tiers with intricate hand-spun sugar flowers that perfectly matched Lily's favorite colors. The crowd gathered around, their voices rising in a joyful off-key rendition of the birthday song. Lily closed her eyes, her face illuminated by the warm, flickering glow of 12 candles. I watched her take a deep breath, her expression a picture of pure, unadulterated happiness. As she leaned forward and blew out the candles to the sound of roaring applause, a profound, unshakable peace settled deep into my bones. They thought I was just the scapegoat, I thought to myself, letting the sounds of the celebration wash over me. They spent their entire lives looking down on me, convinced I was a weak, easily manipulated target, designed solely to absorb their failures. They did not realize that while they were busy playing family obsessed with maintaining a fragile plastic illusion of wealth, I was busy building an empire. I looked at my daughter surrounded by love and knew I had finally broken the cycle. I didn't just take away their venue, I took away their power, and they would never ever cast a shadow over our lives again.